A masked gang ambushed the group, and their faces were hidden from the start. One of the men got hurt, so the girl beside him kept a close watch on his condition, and while chaos roared, just one person stepped up and confronted all three attackers. Even with sword sharp passion burning in his heart, he couldn't shake the nerves because he had no idea he could win a fight without the numbers on his side. Then a boy burst out of nowhere and took down one of the criminals right as the masked man got his weapon knocked away. Masked men shot furious questions at him, demanding to know who he was and why they should care. It turns out the day was saved by an ordinary 8-year-old boy who just happened to be passing by. He stepped in fast and somehow kept people from getting caught in something that could have been impossible to undo. 100 years back, 4 souls crowded around a bleeding man, desperate to master Adelphus, the very force that saved one of them, while Dion, the nearby creature, strained with magic to heal the wounded. Even with his injuries screaming for attention, the master forced a brave smile, acting like nothing happened so the one he saved wouldn't blame himself, yet the blood wouldn't stop, and that's when the creature started to panic about Edelfish. With the seal in hand, the student kept clawing at those wounds on the human body, trying to heal them. But Mother only had one thing on her mind. Could they revive the monster of disaster they'd already defeated? One student straight up said there was no way rebirth could happen because the master had erased him from the world using his magic. The young man fought through the agony, trying to keep Delphus focused as he snapped that the master hadn't even taught him this magic yet, so leaving them would be too soon. Then he insisted it was nothing more than a quick improvisation spell. The master warned that once this magic clicked in a guy's eyes, he'd be able to replay it later and even pull it off on his own, so the young man hated the idea and snapped at the man to stop. The guy who latched onto every chance to speak with the master was Milt. He was a magician. The young man was packed with talent, driven by purpose, and powered by a truly honest heart. The master then drilled him in every magic technique he personally knew. Right there among these girls was Zenobia, the warrior everyone feared, small as she was and hating ghosts, yet she still grew up into the mighty holy sword. Dion, the creature battling to cure the man, was a healer, and once his skills went through the roof, people started calling him the water god's favorite child. Regina, another student's name, was a true hero, and she'd grown strong enough to earn it. But her emotions still ran loose, so now, just like everyone else, she finally broke down and cried. The master threw a heartfelt goodbye to everyone and told his students he was proud, saying that even without him, they'd handle everything and be totally fine because he'd always be there in spirit. Dion hated the idea of parting ways, insisting they still needed the master. The man couldn't even get a word out anymore, only thoughts raced through him. His students had blossomed into beautiful people, and he was sure they'd keep serving the world's good, even without his guidance. Edelphus shut his eyes as other people's tears splashed onto his face, and even in death he couldn't stop thinking he'd gotten lucky because the spot where he died was blessed by his own disciples. He clung to the truth that he'd lived a good life. In this strange new place, the man suddenly heard voices that sounded exactly like what his students had said in their final moments, and those voices thanked Mr. Edelfest for all his hard work. Strolling down the corridor between towering columns, the man demanded answers from the empty air who was speaking to him, and where was he, and the voice calmly returned, calling him to a beautiful, kind goddess. She never stepped into his presence, but she told him this, since Edelthus was human, he could still smash the monster of disaster, so she came to celebrate his contribution to mankind's future and to welcome him as the next new god. The goddess leaned in and asked the man, straight up, if he still carried any regrets, and Edelf couldn't help but replay it all, because becoming a god was the kind of honor you never forget. The man insisted that after 120 unforgettable years, regret had no right to exist because his life was pure beauty. Sure, he never had kids of his own, but he poured his heart into training his students, and they blossomed into outstanding boys and girls. After stewing on it for a while, the man finally realized something was trapping him in the human world. So he confronted the goddess. Did he really erase the disaster monster he'd fought and destroyed even at the cost of his own life? The goddess revealed that the disaster monster is one of God's apostles, so beating it won't be easy, and the man nearly dropped from shock at what he just heard. Adolphus sank into despair, convinced all the years he'd fought for were pointless. Then the girl shrugged it off and just marveled that his feat were incredible, like he could do all of that and still be only human. The goddess kept going, saying the disaster monster would finally doze off for a bit and leave people alone, and then told him they could talk about the rest once he became a god. But the man couldn't swallow a single word of what he'd just heard. The monster of catastrophe is humanity's sworn enemy, and Adelphus's only mission for all 120 years was to end it. Yet, he still can't wrap his head around how it survived just because it fell asleep. Adelphus spun toward the goddess and finally blurted out what he truly wanted. Then the girl lit up, thrilled that he'd stopped hesitating, and gave her his full focus. After a man addressed her, the goddess burst into view and demanded, "So, have you decided to become a god?" And the girl's jaw dropped, because the man truly craved godhood just to wipe out the monster of disaster. The goddess blinked like she'd been caught off guard, paused for a beat, and said, "There were a few restrictions. Then Adelphus, totally lost, demanded she explain what she meant. The disaster monster isn't just some beast, it's a god, or at least it used to be a fallen cursed thing that still clings to divine power, and it keeps that strength by fitting itself with a fallen god. When the power of God collides with the same, equal force on earth, it just can't hold its ground, so the gods don't meddle directly. They move through the people living here. The man shot back that one of his students, Dion, was the water god's golden favorite. Then the goddess confirmed that Oedipus had nailed the exact meaning of what she was trying to tell him. The goddess leaned in and declared that every master's disciple was secretly favored by a different god. Regina, the hero, was the holy goddess's favorite. Milk was the magic god's chosen child, and Zenobia was the god of swords' sweet spot. After the goddess explained the students of Adelphos, she flashed a smile and said he was her absolute favorite, leaving him completely stunned by the shock of it. The girl's cheeks flared as she cleared her throat, then leaned in and said Adelphos would be better off being reborn not as a god, but as a human. But even for this, there were 3 conditions, and the man demanded to know exactly what they were. After he got reincarnated, Adelphos had to promise he'd never defy God, and when his second life ended, he'd be forced to rise as a real, full-fledged god. He agreed to both without flinching. That third condition wasn't just a rule, it was the goddess's real love speaking up, and she wanted to warn her precious child. Before he gets reincarnated, that man has to grind through training in heaven, because if he doesn't prep properly, the monster of disaster can't be beaten. Then he calmly tells them, "If this is what it takes to make me stronger, let everything unfold exactly as it's meant to." The goddess swung open the gates and warned him, heaven and earth don't measure time. The same way before reincarnation, he'll have to dig up every hidden power he's been hiding. From that moment on, Adelphos threw himself into training with a bunch of gods. No distractions, no breaks. Time crawled so slowly it felt unbearable, and he couldn't even bear to imagine how much longer it would take. A century later, there he was, 8-year-old Will Worms, standing in one of the old houses, staring hard at something like it was about to change his life, and it turned out he was the far-off descendant of Adelphos Worms' relative. Turns out, the boy was out there scrubbing the windows, chatting like crazy about how last month, right when he turned 8, he suddenly woke up a memory from his past life. He remembered the goddess warning him that as an apostle of the gods, he had to carry himself with dignity, so now he's a true novice of God, just like the apostle the girl told him about. Will understood one thing: if he started training right now, then when the disaster monster finally gets reborn, he'll be ready to smash it. And every day he trains with the gods, sharpening his skills through hard-earned, proven methods, so he won't just survive the rebirth. He'll be strong enough to win. While the boy bragged that he finally had time to train and handle the cleaning, the young man snapped and attacked, yelling that Will had been cleaning for way too long. Denon, heir of the Worms main line, was 15, and beside him stood Ivan, also from the main line, but only 12. They hated Will and just mocked him, laughing like it was pure entertainment. Will couldn't even figure out where the Worms' whole family line came from, because in his old life, he'd never had a single kid. The boy took the attacks like they were nothing, only mumbling that he'd finish cleaning up soon and then he'd be gone. Turns out, these guys are Edelfest's cousin's descendants after that man died. This family line suddenly became the official one, and now they bragged like they'd climbed into nobility, even though they did nothing to earn it. Diana had always hated the way that boy stared at him. That young man always picked on Will, because he couldn't stand having someone like him around, and every time Danan got his way, he made it crystal clear that Will's place in the house would never change. Both of them went all in to make that kid understand who was really in charge, and they didn't even flinch at the servants watching every second. One of the workers at the Worm's house grabbed Mr. Dane and shouted at him to stop, because if he kept going, Mr. Will could die from the pain. The young man totally ignored the servant's warning. He snapped orders to stop calling Will Master, because that title made them feel equal, and Dinan absolutely hated that. This guy swore he'd never let Will show up again yet. Will didn't even flinch, because Dinan hadn't left a single scratch on him, so to keep the servants from getting spooked, he decided the ritual was over. He decided to let him do whatever he wanted. Then he'd finally cool off, and just like that, it would all be over. Once we slapped magical protection over Danon's target spot on his face, we'll yank the body out of the way at the exact right moment. In the very next instant, the boy's body ripped away from the spot, but it wasn't Danan's doing at all. It was Will's razor-sharp plan, because only a stunt like that would absolutely blow this guy's art wide open. With a sharp cry of pain, the boy reenacted the whole scene as Danon strutted, proud of his power, while Ivan clapped his brother on the back and shouted that he was incredible. As he stormed out, the older brother yanked over the bucket of water the boy was using to clean, then cracked up in loud laughter, so the younger brother snapped for everything to be removed at once. And Will bowed and swore he'd handle it all immediately. Servants rushed up to Will, demanding to know if that boy was alright, and to their shock, he was totally unharmed. The man who tried to back Will up couldn't wrap his head around it. staring in disbelief as he begged for an explanation. How on earth was this possible? Will said his dad had drilled him in combat techniques, so after running into those guys, he barely took a hit and shrugged off the rest, surprising the servants at first, but it still eased their nerves a bit. The servants recalled the boy's parents, Mr. Claudia and Mrs. Maria, both masters of martial arts, and suddenly it all made sense. A son like this was bound to turn out exactly this way. To help the boy somehow, the man told him to drop the unfinished work and come with them, because the gentleman probably wouldn't return anyway. While the boy tried to say no, they cut him off and ordered him to focus on the child's health. The man was so kind, he urged Will to take it easy and stop exhausting himself with non-stop physical labor. And just as he finished, a voice suddenly snapped from nearby, calling out the boy. Soraya, Will's little sister, popped into the room riding on the back of her pet. Run Will scooped her up in his arms and asked, "Did you behave?" And she chirped back a solid yes. After noticing the pet, Will ruffled his fur and patted his head, praising him like he was the goodest boy alive. He'll thank the woman who always stepped in to help the boy take care of his little sister, and the old lady will smile and say she's just happy because that girl is the daughter of Mr. Klugia and Mrs. Maria. That woman raved that Mr. Klugio was pure greatness, shockingly talented, packed with magic, and born to lead. Another girl who worked in the Worms family home claimed that life would be easier if Mr. Klugia were their master, right up until the woman cut her off mid-sentence. That old lady snapped that you'd better watch your mouth, because nothing stays hidden from that gentleman, so the girl shot back an instant apology, and then we just stared out the window, remembering how their parents were gone 2 years ago. The boy had been hearing rumors for ages. His father and uncle were locked in a brutal fight over who would run the house. And then it happened. My uncle married into a powerful family, seized control, and shipped my father off to some remote estate. My father died, shielding the people in the lands he ruled from deadly magical monsters, so they raised a grave for him. And on the stone, beside his name and estate, it declared that a great leader lies at rest here. The kids couldn't last a second longer there, so they were sent back to their uncle's house, only now, the head of the House of Worms was the one taking them under his care. In this house, Will and Saria get slammed with hard work every day and they're barely fed. Just when the boy's memories from his past life snapped back into place, he could have fled, but he refused to abandon his little sister. And we couldn't stop wondering if they ever saw the real him. Would his old students still accept him? After his mentor died, his students banded together to form the Council of Sages, an operation that stops monsters from ever crawling back into the human world. And people say this crew is so powerful, it could rival the king himself, even with the church. 100 years back, the students of Edelfuss were still only 20, so yeah, they're alive today, no mystery there. The boy demanded how he could reach the founders of the Council of Sages. The man just shook his head and said even their own master couldn't do it. The servant told them, if you kids ace the Hero Academy and crush your grades, you might earn a spot on the mission. The kid had no clue which school the man meant, so he shot back. It was founded by the Council of Sages to train the next generation of heroes. The old lady leaned in and warned him this entrance exam was brutal, but she promised this. If Mr. Will could pass and get in, the school would foot every bill, and all the kids could cram into one shared dorm and live together. Even if you don't make it into the School of Heroes, she says you've still got options. You can always take the entrance exam somewhere else, like the School of Sages or the Night School. Will got lost in thought back in his past life. He'd learned only the elite could join the School of Sages or the School of Knights, and now they're just backup plans, until a voice snapped him out of it. Turns out the servants had already caught wind of what that woman was whispering to the boy, so the man pressed, asking whether the master would take the exam at the School of Heroes, while another maid laughed it off, saying she had zero doubt the kid would sail through the selection. Will felt a wave of embarrassment hit him, then he shook his head and said it wasn't about whether he'd pass first. He had to lock in, figure out if taking the exam was even worth the shot. The boy leaned in and asked, so are there age limits? And the man shot back, usually no. But here's the catch, every intelligent being has to be humanoid, and how long they live depends on their race. The School of Heroes doesn't just take one kind of student, it brags about graduates from both the Sages and the Knights, so it's packed with everyone from kids to older students. Will's mind raced as he figured out how to get permission from the head of the house because Dan and Ivan would definitely try to stop him from taking that exam, so he hurried over to reassure the boy right away. The servant swore that getting in only needs the applicant's own okay, even if they're a kid, and that nobody dares challenge the school-run mission organization. They even wrote that rule in on purpose, to slam the door on outside influence. The man swore the servants would hunt down and deliver the boy's application forms just so that the other gentleman wouldn't sniff a thing out, and Will couldn't help but feel jittery because he never imagined they'd go this hard. Once the problem was handled, Will stared at the spotless window glittering like new, admitted he'd stayed up a bit too long, and declared it was time to finally get up and do something. The boy spun to the servants and demanded they watch his little sister again. Then they nodded fast and promised they'd keep close. He snapped to his sister and demanded she act right. Then he turned right back to their pet, making sure it would watch over the little mistress too. After we say goodbye to Surya and Rune, we'll rush to handle the rest of his business. Stepping outside, the boy pushed through the crowd and seethed at the thought that they still weren't getting fed right at home, then even decided to snare a bird for dinner so his sister wouldn't go hungry. We headed to the corner of the next house, found the perfect spot, and crept up to a deserted doorway right next to the castle walls. Hugging the wall around the castle grounds, Will stared at the fence and wondered, could he really leap high enough to clear it? He clenched his jaw and poured his magic into his legs. With a few explosive jumps, the boy cleared the wall in a flash and slipped through unseen since the guard posted right there was out cold, asleep on duty. On the other side, Will crashed onto the ground like he'd been thrown, then rolled hard to steady himself. Got up and sprinted straight into the forest, staring in disbelief at how he had not a single scratch, proving his God-blessed training paid off. When he finally reached the place he'd set his sights on, a bird wheeled through the sky. His target. No question, he snatched a small stone in one hand, then focused the right amount of magic through his thumb to squeeze it into perfect power. The second the boy spotted his mark, he locked on and tightened his magic so it couldn't slip. Then, right on cue, Will whipped a stone through the air and nailed a bird in flight, sending the duck plummeting straight down. When Will hit the ground, he saw that the duck was already down, and he realized hunting was sharpening his skills perfectly. Then he pictured his younger sister lighting up when he came back with dinner, since she absolutely loves poultry meat. Will got yanked out of his thoughts by a scream, and the second he heard the chaos nearby, he knew something was going down, like a full-on fight was breaking out. The battle was close enough that you could hear it clearly, and the girl beside the wounded fighter shook with nerves as she tried to do anything, while a single man with a sword faced off against 3 opponents. Panic gripped him hard, because he had no clue if he could hold off his enemies when they outnumbered him by so many. The man spun toward the girl and ordered her to get out. He'd stay behind to fight off the attackers so she could walk away safe, but she snapped back that if she ditched the team, nobody would be there to cure them. The man snapped back that this was exactly what their rivals wanted, so he didn't strike them directly, hoping to slow them down for a while. Will be stuck on the sidelines as she tries to talk sense into one of the team members, because if her healing plan was really the opponent's setup, then without healing anyone, they're basically useless. The boy stared at the brave warrior and knew, right there, he wasn't the type to bolt from a battlefield, yet even with that iron courage, he still couldn't take on 3 opponents. Turns out, those 9 people sprawled on the ground are the man's fallen companions. People yell for the girls to heal them. And while Will watches, he can't stop thinking, why isn't the enemy striking them, keeping them from running for escape? Still, the boy knew it couldn't be that easy right then. The girl helping her team got slammed from behind, and there was no dodging it. He sprinted in just in time, shoved the attacker back, and saved the terrified girl only. Things were nowhere near as okay as we'd hoped. In the next heartbeat, one of the attackers slammed a punch into the man's back. He didn't even get a second to defend himself or his team, and he knew they needed help fast. Will kept staring as the man trapped on the battlefield fought to stay upright, and the whole scene felt like a pack of wolves going in on one helpless bear. The man kept pressuring the girl to go, insisting the capital was right there and that the healer should have already slipped out to call for help, yet the girl refused to leave. The warrior pushed the healer to see it. This was the only way for all of them, and told her to sprint off without looking back. The girl swallowed her fear, nodded, and did exactly what she was told. The man stood his ground to shield the wounded and keep himself safe, while the girl, choking back tears, sprinted off to shout for help. The team's enemies spotted the healer sprinting for the capital, and they snapped into action, deciding they'd strike from behind again to cut her down. The man shoved off yet another attack, then grabbed the girl's attention and demanded she trust him because her one true mission was reaching the city. The girl sensed trouble in her gut and spun around just as an enemy lunged in to strike the warrior from behind right after the healer had warned him. No one had a second to waste. Will was done watching injustice from the sidelines, so he jumped in, snapped into action, and punched the opponent that was about to attack the warrior. The man and the girl never saw this coming. They didn't even realize someone was lurking nearby, so they just stared in shock at the boy who'd come to save them. One of the opponents crumpled to the ground and couldn't lift himself back up, and the boy went dead serious because he was determined to help people stuck in a desperate situation. Will admitted he didn't fully get what was going on, but just watching everything, made up his mind he'd back the minority and lend them his help, and right away, the man shot back. So who is the boy? Will didn't brag at all. He just smiled and told him, plain and simple, that he was an ordinary 8-year-old kid passing through. The boy rushed to tell the girl she didn't have to worry about him anymore. She could go back to treating everyone who could no longer fight. Will told everyone not to stress, because in the near future, nobody would be able to stop him then. At the same time, an opponent lunged for the boy, but he couldn't land the attack. Will definitely snapped into action, intercepted the attacker's arm, and yanked him down hard to the ground. Then, cocky and unshakable, Will declared he'd never let anyone get close to the girl. One by one, those bandits crumpled as a boy swooped in to save people getting attacked, and the moment the enemy leader saw his whole crew get wiped out by a kid, his jaw dropped in disbelief. In the very next heartbeat, with the leader caught off guard, Will lunged and drove a blade straight into his mask. Will's strike blasted the skull mask apart, and even the enemy's tooth went flying out after the hit. After taking down the leader, the boy snapped his head toward the other side and caught the roar of a fight breaking out. He stared at how that man crushed the opponents just as easily as if they never had a chance. The warrior thanked the boy as he tied up their rivals and told him he'd done him a huge favor, and Will just grinned, saying he was glad to help their team. The boy didn't feel like he'd done anything out of the ordinary, so simple thanks came easy then. Later, he watched a girl heal one of the injured. The healer looked utterly drained, sweat streaming down her face, so it seemed the girl needed treatment too until she snapped back, protested hard, and refused to help. She clocked how wrecked her team was and refused to waste a second on herself because those who'd been crumpled on the ground for ages needed healing fast. The boy pushed himself to help again because there was no way the healer could have handled it alone, so he asked her to give him this problem, and the girl stared in shock as Will's palms burst into light. The boy flung his arms wide, then started chanting a spell to heal every warrior hurt in the fight. Once the spell was cast, a massive seal erupted into the ground, trapping every fallen warrior inside. The man and the girl stared in awe as the boy worked, shocked by how young he was, yet how terrifyingly skilled he already was, while Will didn't blink at anything, and after a moment, the exact same seal flared in his eye, just like it did on Earth. The boy kept whispering, and the people around him suddenly erupted in a tiny burst of light like a flickering flame, only it didn't burn them at all, it poured life straight into them. The healer stared at her own hands, stunned. Every wound was already gone, and she felt brand new, fully cured. The warriors sprawled nearby still didn't crack their eyes, but the girl could see it clear as day. They looked way better than they did before. The man, still checking himself for injuries, shook and said, "What the boy pulled off was nothing short of a miracle. His talent didn't just shield the team and boost them, it straight up sealed every wound and erased every last bit of damage." She was still stunned by what she'd just seen with her own eyes, so she demanded to know how he healed everyone when he never even touched a single person. Will told her that if she kept grinding, she'd make it too, and later it hit him again. One of his students, Dion, who also doubted herself, until the healer stepped in and promised she'd never fail. With a quick flashback, Will admitted he'd mastered this skill from the very start, and then grinned like he'd already won. Later, when he clocked that she was totally lost in his eyes, he snapped back to reality and begged her not to take a single word he said as truth. The guy standing beside him pointed it out again. This wasn't just a boost for his whole team, he wiped out every last problem and healed them all, and that's why they call him their savior. The man turned his speech into a deal, offering the boy a reward and trying to pay him back, only for the boy to shut it down, insisting he didn't need a thing. He spun around and told the team they didn't owe him a thing, then he waved them off, wishing them a safe trip home. As the boy backed away, the girl blurted out, "What's your name?" because their whole team didn't even know the identity of the person who saved them. Will didn't give his name and didn't stop running. He yelled back that he wasn't worthy of such an honor, and even while the man and the girl just stood there, stunned, they couldn't quite grasp how amazing a boy they just met. After we're done hunting, we'll march back home together, his back loaded with several captured birds. Later, the boy kicked it into high gear and bolted forward because he could feel someone hot on his tail. He pushed himself even harder, convinced speed would scare the pursuer off, but it was all for nothing. Since the surveillance wouldn't quit, Will slammed the brakes, demanded the pursuer show him the eyes, and then the bushes rustled like something was watching. So the boy yanked the prey off his back, braced himself, and snapped into a counterattack. Then right in front of him, out of nowhere, something appeared that didn't even look scary or remotely threatening. We stared at the guy in pursuit and couldn't wrap our heads around why a slime-like monster was hunting him down. The slime bounced side to side, snapping the man's focus to it, but the boy couldn't figure out why this thing kept dogging him. Later, the slime came to a stop and fixed its gaze on Will, then Will's face twisted with confusion because it totally looked like the creature was begging to tag along with him. The boy asked the creature if it wanted to stick with him, and it nodded yes right away, so Will didn't even hesitate and let the slime tag along with him. Then he told it to tuck itself inside his clothes so nobody would spot it. The slime didn't even fight back once the man tugged it in, it vanished under his shirt. The boy tried to point to a different spot, but he said nothing, just stared downward. Now everyone can see it. His shirt looks weird right at the chest. Someone's gonna ask where this kid even got that creature from, because sure, the city's packed with heroes who drag monsters around, but this one, it's an 8-year-old child. After he came back, Will shot straight to the Worms family stable because his little sister adored hanging out there. Will was the only one stuck living in the stable all the time, but he'd grown comfortable there, especially with friendly neighbors nearby. He hurried up to the horses, ran his hands over their coats, and asked if they'd been behaving. After a little time, the younger sister burst into the stable on her pet, escorted by an elderly maid who kept a watchful eye on her the whole way. Will clutched his sister in his arms and blurted, "Are you okay?" because she was never meant to be here. She was supposed to be on vacation with her grandmother in a whole other place. The woman shot the boy an apology and told him Saria only wanted to be with her brother today, so she asked him to come to the stable. Then we'd check his sister and find out if it was actually true. She got flustered, looked straight at the ground, and felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she still mustered the courage to ask Will if she could hang out with her brother. Will paused for a beat, then told her it was totally possible. He'll apologize to the old lady for how his younger sister kept bothering her, but she waves it off and says it's no trouble at all, then tells him she'll come by tomorrow to pick the girl up again. The girl sank into sadness, crushed by what she'd just heard, while the boy wrapped up his talk with the woman and muttered that next time, he probably wouldn't be in the stable around this kind of hour. Then the animal started acting downright weird, sniffing the boy nonstop, yet he couldn't shake his worry about his younger sister's droopy, sickly look, so he demanded to know what had happened. After a while, Rune started barking like crazy, as if something super interesting had just appeared ahead, and Saria felt a jolt of fear. The pet wedged itself between the brother and sister and sniffed at Will, and Will had no idea why it was acting so weird. Something squirmed like crazy under his shirt. Then wham! It burst out from under his clothes, and the boy froze in pure shock. Will noticed the dog already tearing into the slime, and it didn't sit right with him at all, so he told the boy to hide the creature and make sure the pet never touched it. When Saria spotted the slime, confusion and shock hit her first, but then her eyes lit up like fireworks because she straight up adored it, saying it looked just like jelly. She scooped up her new friend in her arms, pressed her face against his, and gushed that he was adorable while the slime soaked up the attention like a dream. But the second Saria tried to squeeze him a bit tighter, his body started to shift, changing shape right before her eyes. The boy lit up because his sister finally liked her new friend, but he snapped at her to keep quiet and not let anyone know this slime was here, so she swore to guard their secret and kept hugging that squishy jelly tight. I reminded him why he'd left the city walls in the first place, and we urged his sister to grab something to eat because right near the loot, the woman watching the girl had sandwiches too. After a little while, the younger sister beamed and thanked her brother for the mouth-watering treat Will cooked up on the stove made with his own hands, while the boy returned the favor, thanking her for jumping in and helping. After he changed, the boy told them there was a blanket in the stable, so their pet snatched it up and tucked it around the girl who was lying there, and my brother kept panicking that Saria would still freeze. Even though it was cold out, the younger sister wasn't. She curled up beside the dog, and it radiated warmth under her. Her eyelids grew heavy, so she shut her eyes with a small, sleepy smile. Will, stretched out beside his sister, leaned in and asked what was weighing on her mind. Had the new father snapped at her, and then he pressed, checking if she'd been good while he was gone. Saria clutched the blanket and sank back into sadness because she couldn't stand the thought that her older brother was about to leave for the academy to study. Will had absolutely no clue his little sister was upset about all this, so he guessed maybe the servants tipped her off about his plan to study at the School of Heroes. The boy told Saria, "Don't worry, when I finally step into the academy, you and Rune will be right there with me." But Saria didn't buy it at first. Fear clenched her chest because she was terrified her brother would disappear and leave her alone. Will stopped his little sister cold, scooped her up in a hug, and said he was dying to see how hard Saria would hit the books at the academy. Then she looked up and promised she'd give it everything she had. After they sprawled together for a while, Will finally said, "All right, Saria, time to head back to your grandmother." And his younger sister quickly swore she'd behave. 3 days later, the boy was back at his daily cleaning like it was nothing, until the servants kept insisting he didn't have to keep doing it all the time. Ever since his memories from his past life snapped back, he couldn't stop training. Even as he scrubbed that toilet clean, all he could think about was leveling up. Will's magic churned through his body the exact moment the charge hit, like his power moved against his own motions, and that brutal workout didn't just build his muscles, it sharpened how he wielded magic power too. On the brother's orders, Will shoved his hands into cleaning duties for extra training barehanded, but not a speck touched him, because a thin magical film sealed his palms clean and safe, turning it into a brutal, hands-on exercise. The boy's thoughts snapped in half when he heard shouting spilling from the rooms beside the toilet, so he spun around, leaning in to catch every word of what they were arguing about. Ivan and Danan were the ones making all that noise, and the elder snapped at someone that their move was pure selfishness, while the younger brother shot back, that even though they were in the rescue squad, all the brothers belonged to the Worms family. The boys went to complain to her, but she didn't even blink. She shrugged and told them to take all their problems straight to the family head. Danan told everyone that while the family head was gone, he ran the estate. Then the girl stopped trusting the guys and marched up to the maid, demanding where Will Worms was now, and the maid shot back that he'd been invited to the second floor. Soft footsteps crept near the toilet, and you could tell someone was coming straight for it. When the doors flew open, a boy slid right in front of the girl she was cleaning, and you could tell she never expected visitors. She stared at the kid and demanded, "Are you the Will Worm I've been looking for?" The boy jumped up to speak properly to the girl and said she'd finally found the one she needed. Then he pressed, So why were you even looking for me? She bowed to Willing's greeting, smiled, and declared she was part of the rescue squad, and then she told him the Hero Academy entrance exam is tomorrow, coming straight to warn him. Dane and Kirsty couldn't wrap their heads around it. Why would that relative he hated so much slip an entrance exam application in? Without telling his brothers a word, Dane only figured the form must have gone through, because they came straight to him. The boy demanded to know why the girl came all the way to tell him the news in person, and she smirked that she always shows up herself whenever she expects something to go her way. Then a rescue squad member glanced at the guy standing behind them, and that one look shot nerves straight through the group. The girl totally ignored them again, then snapped at the boy to chase her faster. Sure, we'd follow her, but Danan hated every second of it being shut out. Like that didn't sit right with him. As the boy and girl turned to leave, the young man snapped, lunging in from behind at a rescue team member and bragging that she wouldn't get away with treating him like that. She spun around, pressed her index finger to his fist, and the next second he looked like he'd been struck by lightning. Danayan didn't see it coming. No one in his house had any right to shut him down. His face twisted into a grimace of confusion and pain, and Will, watching it all unfold, felt a jolt of surprise too. The boy stared in awe as the girl stopped a speeding fist with just one finger, and that kind of magic screamed, "Master!" Then the girl shot Danian a chilling glare and warned him if he kept acting like that, she'd call it betrayal. Danan's fear hit so hard his eyes flooded with tears as he crumpled to the ground. And in that trembling moment, he decided to ask if he could bring his younger sister along to the academy with him. She zipped past the servant and snapped back that the boy could handle it because during the exams, both relatives and even pets were allowed to stay in the academy dorms. And on top of that, he could even take slime. A servant from the Worms household blurted that she'd go fetch his younger sister and bring her to the boy. Will barely even had time to thank her before she dashed off. After a while, one of the rescue team members noticed a guy still slumped on the floor and he snapped, annoyed, that he'd take the entrance exam too. She locked eyes with the young man and told him he didn't have to hide. Go ahead and do exactly what he wanted. She bowed deeply, showing pure respect, then said, "The Hero Academy is always ready to take in applications from anyone who wants to enroll and train." On her way to the academy, Saria couldn't stop smiling. She was finally headed somewhere by carriage, and the whole trip felt thrilling. Even the horse meant to pull the people filled. Carriage had her hooked. Saria locked eyes on the window, hunting for something else cool. Then her older brother snapped at her to stop slamming her weight into the glass, and later, the moment a girl nearby started calling his name, the boy's attention peeled away from his little sister. We looked back and saw his pet going wild, sniffing a rescue team member, and the boy snapped that Rune had to stop because it was humiliating the girl so badly, but she didn't care at all and insisted everything was totally fine. She blushed, tucked her scarf over her mouth, paused like she was gathering courage, and then asked quietly if she could pet someone else's pet. Will's mood flipped to bright joy, and he happily let the girl do whatever she wanted because his pet clearly didn't mind getting all the petting too. She smiled even harder. She got to pet someone else's dog, and that pup clearly adored her. One rescue team member then said, "Our dog is huge," and Will jumped in, ready to spill a little story about how he showed up in their lives. Turns out, when Rune was just a puppy, he wandered into the boys' garden on Will's birthday, so he wasn't just a new dog. He was the exact same age as Will and still growing up right alongside him. Later, the girl caught the boy's little sister staring at her like she had secrets, and she finally snapped, "Is everything okay with the story, alums?" That girl kept staring at the rescue team member just to figure out her name, so Saria stepped up, introduced herself, and did it on purpose, even though she already knew Will's younger sister's name. She cleared her throat and blurted out an apology for not doing it sooner, then admitted she'd completely spaced on introducing herself and couldn't catch the right moment. One of the rescue squad gently patted the girl's head and told her, "Your name's Artie," then added, "Artie Zine on Barling." Saria didn't seem to hear a word the girl was saying. She just stared right back, eyes locked on her the whole time. Artie got mortified by all that close attention, and Saria quickly blurted out that the girl's hair was so gorgeous, that's why she couldn't stop staring, and later, the girl even pointed out that Artie's eyes were just as beautiful. The rescue team girl's cheeks turned beet red, and the girl beside her stepped in close and wrapped her arms around her, then Rune's heart melted too, and she started nuzzling and rubbing against both girls. After a bit, Will finally march up and ask the girl how she knew his brothers would actually let him take the entrance exam. They already said the person who brought the application demanded one thing: make sure nobody blocks the boy from doing it. So yeah, you'll instantly clock that. The man from the Worms house helped him. Because his brothers had to know how kind he was, the servants expected payback, and the boy spiraled into worry over and over until he couldn't stop. Artie clocked Will's confused face and immediately blurted that there was nothing to fear. The academy refused to hear a request from anyone who showed up with an exam application, and the boy finally eased up a bit after hearing that, because it felt genuinely encouraging to him. Right near the end of her trip, Saria pressed to the window, grabbed her brother's attention, and shouted, "Look right there." She pointed out that they had already arrived. because from the carriage window, you could clearly see the massive building, the Academy of Heroes. The moment the carriage jolted to a stop, Run and Saria bolted outside and sprinted straight for the building, only to find it right there, huge and surprising, and the girl practically lit up with delight. Will race after his younger sister, yelling that she can't run like that. She has to watch her steps so she won't tumble, and then Artie fires back that she'll take the company straight to their new dorm room. The boy and his little sister, plus their trusty pet, hauled themselves into room 401. Already, he escorted the siblings to their new place like he promised, and told them straight up, if Will could nail that entrance exam, they'd stay in this room forever. After handing the keys to the boy, the girl promised she'd bring him to the kids' room later, so Will could tuck Saria in there while he studied. The boy stared in shock. How could the academy even have places like that? And Artie told him the reason with so many students juggling kids, they built special, fully equipped rooms so parents could breathe easier. Artie added that the kids get lessons in rooms like these too, right on time for their age, and get this, some of the guys are younger than Saria, while others are even older than Will. After hearing every word Artie spat out, the boy snapped back that it was downright weird those kids' ages were wildly different, and some might even be older than Will himself, and the girl nodded along like, yeah, that checks out. My Hero Academia is where the world's top heroes in training flock to sharpen their quirks, with training grounds like the canteens, dorms built just for them, and comfort that makes you feel right at home while you level up. Now you'll finally see why the Hero Academy was shoved outside the capital, because right near the capital, the School of Heroes didn't just sit there, it spread out with tons of buildings all over its land. Once he saw what they were doing to him and his sister in that new place, he decided the exam was a must no matter what, so he and Saria could stay in the dorm and never dig up more of what happened back in the worm's house. Already, he also hauled her brother and sister to where Saria's staying while Will was stuck studying. The girl shot her older brother a tearful wave goodbye, then stayed put with the tutor. It turns out Saria's new place is run by servants. The academy also takes care of, then Artie snapped back that the hero school is responsible for that too, and the shock hit hard. As she strode down the corridor, the girl finally decided to spill what she'd been told about Will Worm's ignorance, about how the academy runs everything, and about exactly how its entrance exams work. The boy remembered his old life back then. There was no academy at all. His family worked from dawn to night, and he barely saw the outside world. So when he entered this life, his knowledge was still pretty limited too. Striding down the hall, Artie leaned in and asked Will if he'd checked his favorability with the guardian deity, only for Will to stare back like, I have no clue. The girl said this technique was created by a legendary sage, one of the Council of Sages, and Will still couldn't pin down who they meant. Artie leaned in and said, the great sage isn't just anyone he's taught by Adelphus's worms, led by Milt Edelweiss. When the boy heard it, he couldn't hide his pride in his old student. Milt didn't just earn a surname. He forged a brand new technique on his own. No help from his mentor. Will also decided to grill him on why Milt got the nickname The Great Sage and why it wasn't something like, say, The Great Sage either. The girl said Adolphus's Warm Yourself act earned him the posthumous title of The Great Sage, and the boy was so shocked he couldn't even believe he had a nickname like that. Later, the boy pressed her again, who were the guardian deities. Artie snapped out the answer like she'd been thinking it all along. Every single human has a guardian deity watching over them. A guardian deity is basically a human god, one who leads an entire race, and sometimes, even more than humans, other creatures get the divine protection too. The biggest legend here is Dion. He sits on the purchasing council and somehow has the water god's favor. When Will heard the name of one more of his former students, his mind went blank. Was that kid's last name even Milt's? Or had he picked it up from the life he had before? If the deities pick you, you'll be granted powers tied to your patron and the ones who get the biggest blessing. Those lucky few become the god's favorites. That's why the person whose deity is a basic human god isn't complicated at all. After the boy spilled everything he'd asked her, they finally pushed into the room where the seal was kept. Turns out, that room was packed with some kind of machine that measured how much the gods favored you. Rushing up to the magic crystal, the girl still reading nearby told Will to press his hand to the glass, and since this test needed no prep, she basically told him he could start immediately, so Will slapped his hand onto the ball. Once he remembered who that boy really was, everything snapped into place. He recalled the gods he trained with session after session, and after his rebirth, Adelphus didn't just become a boy named Will, he became an apostle too, training under many gods. The boy shut his eyes tight and swore those deities would stand guard over him. Will's thoughts got slammed to a halt when Artie's voice cut in, telling him the measurement was finished, and he could finally let go of the crystal. Will stared at his hands and felt nothing at all. Then he snapped his gaze to the boy and demanded to know if he was okay. The boy shot back that everything was fine and then leaned in to ask what name of his patron deity was carved into the book. She stared down at the book's pages and started reading right there. It claimed that the patron saint of Will Worms is just a simple human deity. The boy froze, totally thrown off, because he never expected to hear something like that. After that little shock hit him, the boy snapped his gaze to the girl and asked, "So the human god is really your only guardian? and she nodded yes. That answer did not sit right with him. Will blurted out, "Does anyone ever pass out when using that thing?" because something about his body felt off. She flipped through the book, mulled it over for a beat, then told him that at least as far as she knew, no one had ever seen anything like those cases before. Will felt a sting of disappointment because he'd trained with the gods for ages before getting reborn, and he was convinced they'd all be thrilled with him. Everyone treated him like a friend, but not a single one of them wanted to be his patron, and that truth hit the boy so hard he could barely believe it. 10 seconds later, Artie snapped, "Put your hand on the crystal again." While she stayed steady, her palm pressed to the book's page, and Will did exactly what she asked. This time, he wasn't as frantic, but he still shut his eyes for a little while, then snapped them open and realized he'd been dropped into a totally different place. We'll scout around, and the moment we do, we realize the room he's trapped in is massive, with towering columns rising all around, both ahead and behind him. As he looked up, we'll bet he was staring at the world of the gods then. When she spotted the boy, a girl slid up from behind him and demanded to know what on earth had happened. Turns out, that girl was the very goddess who'd met the boy back before his rebirth, so she leaned in and asked, "Is this really Edel?" And he answered, "In this situation, yeah, I'm the will that remains." Later, more gods slipped up on the couple and realized Adelphis was back with them, and when they strode over to greet the boy, the goddess's nerves immediately flared. The gods erupted in noise, grilling the boy for why he was back. Someone even swore he'd already died once and somehow returned again, but the boy snapped back that he was alive and that he now had a whole new name. The goddess lunged in, trying to wake every god who had shown up around the boy, and she demanded, "Well, what in the world happened to you?" But the boy shot back, "So have you all been watching what I've been doing?" Step by step, the gods started whispering that they weren't just waiting, they were locked in, watching every move Will made in the human world. After nobody even flinched at the goddess trying to calm everyone down, fury exploded in her. She snapped that it was pissing her off. After she spoke, the girl dragged out an ancient spell and shut everyone up. Every god went blank, staring, and only muttered in pure confusion, while the goddess demanded to know how Will got to the gods, and Will had no idea what to say. Later, every god finally vanished, and Will was left alone with the goddess side by side. The girl pressed him again, asking how the boy ended up here, and this time, he had no clue how to explain it. To the gods, people are basically tiny ants, feed one for fun all you want, and the god won't suddenly care. They might ignore humans completely, even when their precious child is living right here among us. The goddess kept waiting for the boy to reply, then stared at him and realized he wasn't going to speak. His eyes screamed that his mind was stuck somewhere else. Wanting a change of pace, the goddess leaned in and asked Will if he truly loved living alone. He admitted he can't help wondering how wildly the people's world differs from the world the girl is living in right now. The goddess shut her eyes and echoed what Will had said. Their worlds were nothing alike. After his rebirth, the girl shot him a question, "How's he doing now?" and Will just smiled and said he was fine. He decided to fire off the question that burned in his mind: what would have happened if he died before his memories of his past life ever came back? The goddess snapped back that it could never happen, no way, ever. The boy froze, stunned, and shot the girl a confused look, like, "What do you mean?" Moments later in Ugami, the god of dogs, Ugami swooped in toward the boy and the girl, and the deity declared that Laxanis had been watching over them all along, just waiting for someone to notice. The boy stared back and demanded, "Who is Laxanis, and how am I supposed to keep track of him?" Turns out, Rune, the little pet the boy and his younger sister Dot on, is actually the divine child of Lixanes, and Will nearly lost his mind because in his head his dog was about as ordinary as it gets. Ugan shot back that he was Luxanis, the deity himself, and that he'd sent his child to Earth the moment Will Worms was born right after. The goddess blurted that she'd begged Luxanis to make it happen. God revealed that Rune had zero memories of the divine world because he was dropped onto Earth while he was still just a puppy, yet he still carries the same magic power as Laxana himself. Now his mission is simple: always help, always protect Will. The boy also noticed that his pet felt more like a loyal friend than some scary guard because it was brilliant, gentle, and always watched over his little sister. Inugami grinned. The deity realized his child really was a friendly creature at heart. The god gently stroked the boy's head and realized he already understood how Rune and Will got along. Then later, Laxana beamed as he said he was thrilled to meet the boy face to face. Even the god of dogs admitted it. While the boy had zero memory of that day, it was still him who named Lixinus Rune's child because, honestly, he didn't remember a thing. Inugami said, "Yeah, it's true. Because the very first time that puppy met the kid, the boy instantly called him that name, so they just ran with it and kept him that way." Right when the talk was heating up, a fresh goddess burst in, calling to the boy and saying she was sending her own child to the human world. Will snapped around and found the slime goddess sprawled on the ground, and she leaned in to add, with a wink, that he really looked adorable. After the hunt, the boy remembered the truth. His side was suddenly joined by a goddess-like creature, and his younger sister later couldn't stop playing with her. The slime goddess even bragged that Saria is way better at picking names than her older brother. Will didn't really get what the gods were saying, so he just blurted out his thanks, and the deities looked at him like, well, this kid's a little too silly. Later, Will sweated it over and straight up asked the gods whether their kids, stuck in the human world, still carry divine powers of their own. Lixanus just shook his head and said, it's not that simple. You've got mere mortals and kids and then demigods like Inugami, where each deity's children are just ordinary dogs, but it doesn't stop there. Some demigods are guarded by powerful guardians and can unleash real magic. Turns out the rune and the slime named Fury were both demigods with wild, unusual powers. While the dog god kept talking, the goddess waited and pressed. So how much longer are you going to chat? The girl had her own questions ready to fire at the boy, but Laxana cut in. Not yet, he's not finished. The goddess wanted to question the boy about how he'd survived these past years, but she never got the chance because reality started to slip and they were about to turn transparent. And that shock hit the girl hard. The boy quickly apologized, realizing his run in the world of the gods was probably over. The dog god promised he'd always watch over the boy's well-being, and the slime god swore that even Fury would stay by his side and beside his sister too. The boy thanked everyone for worrying about him. But as one of the gods tried to speak, time ran out fast. The girl pushed to share everything she knew about Will's human life and what his future holds as a deity. The girl didn't even get a word out. Everything froze as we stared up, wondering what the goddess was about to tell him. The moment the boy felt someone staring, he spun around and there was Artie, locked on him like he had to say something right now. She decided to unload every bit of exam info and all those little details on the boy, and then made it clear if she wanted to master her specialty and pass the exam, they'd have to do an inspection at the temple. After she dumped all those answers on him, she leaned in and asked, so do you get it all? Will stared back and his mouth went blank. He had no idea what to say. Later, he decided to thank Artie and promised he'd give everything he had to crush that exam, and Artie was genuinely relieved by his attitude. Right as he stepped out of the room, we decided to ask if he could check ahead of time what the entrance exams would cover. Artie said they'd be split into written and practical parts. The girl kept going, saying there are different kinds of practical exams. Score high and you can rest easy because you've cleared it, and if the deity has blessed you, you're the lucky one. Will leaned in and asked Artie straight up if she had a guardian deity of her own. Artie answered that her guardian was the god of the sword, and Will instantly remembered that terrifying, powerful man. The boy also clocked that even though she was still young, the girl was already on the rescue squad. She admitted it was true, but she wasn't an assistant yet because she'd just cleared the test to get in. As they strolled and chatted, they realized the gods were watching them, especially since he'd only just visited those gods not long ago. So how did you pull off this kind of success? He asked, and she grinned back, saying she'd trained like crazy and she'd wanted to get into the squad for real. The god of the sword, guarding Will itself, couldn't make sense of why the boy refused to trust his mentors. Then the other god demanded he come back and explain every last thing. The goddess couldn't do a thing. She never expected him to return this fast, and she knew she wouldn't get a word in before it happened. So the flame god stepped up and demanded everyone calm down. The deity spun toward the god of lies because it was his own child who built the device that sparked all of this, and that's exactly why Will stayed on edge around every single deity now. The genie god of lies stepped in to protect his kid and snapped that the device wasn't that bad, but the truth hit hard. The humans had zero idea the apostles even existed, so the gods had no power to change a thing. Another god demanded answers. Why couldn't this device read their strength? Then he spelled out exactly who the apostles were, the flame. God even hesitated, doubting for a second that he was really speaking to a deity just like himself. Lately, only the dog god had spelled out the difference between kids and demigods, so when the man recalled it, everything finally clicked. God still couldn't grasp how they were connected to the will, and that flame-burning rage surged in him as he snapped and tried to explain it all again. Will, reborn after striking a deal with God, turns out to be no ordinary kid, because God straight up asks him if he's been stamped as a divine prisoner and whether he's really the same Rune and Fury everyone talks about. The flame god bragged that he was born from the supreme god and the guardian princess, while the apostle was a demigod packing real magic. So Will, blessed by God himself, now stepped forward as God's messenger. The man snapped into explaining himself. Turns out the apostles are demigod beasts, and Will is one of them. Because his magic matches the demigod guardians, then the god of flame cut him off, roaring that he'd confused everything again. The flame god snapped that they were talking about some mortal-made device, and then smugly said she couldn't possibly gauge the power of a god. After thinking it through for a while, the man finally snapped that everything was clear, but the god of flame didn't buy it for a second, convinced the deity had just missed the whole point again. Staring at the boy once more, the man revealed to be the god of war smirked and said he didn't think Will would face a single problem because, after all, Will was his disciple. Other deities nodded, saying, "Of course it'll happen because that kid's also a disciple of the god of flame, the god of lies, and the god of the sword." The goddess was in a heated clash with another deity over why the Will must send a new demigod beast to help, and the flame goddess snapped back that letting guardians handle it would only invite trouble. Once every chat and check was done, we headed back for his younger sister. She was right there nearby, playing with a doll while the other kids ran around. Her older brother lifted a hand in a wave so she could spot him, and Saria's face lit up because he'd already come back to grab her. The girl waved too. But right behind her, a boy who was messing around with his friend sprinted by and accidentally brushed Saria. The girl reeled in agony and clutched her head, wincing hard as pain shot through her. Saria stared at the floor, tears pouring down her cheeks, too wrapped up in suffering to notice. Until it was too late, that a vase had started to slip off the pedestal and come crashing down. Artie saw it coming and tried to shout a warning to the girl so she could dodge the falling thing, but before a single word left his mouth, Will was already sprinting. Artie barely got a blink in before the vase exploded into shards, and when he looked up, the girl was gone. Only toys lay scattered beneath the wreckage. Artie's eyes went wide in disbelief. Everything hit so fast it felt unreal. She could barely make out it as the older brother scooped his younger sister up in his arms and carried her to a different spot. Artie stared as the girl tending the kids suddenly sprinted over to her brother and sister. How on earth could she cross that kind of distance in seconds, even while clutching a child in her arms? The rescue team member barely even registered what happened as the boy bolted to help his younger sister, and Will let out a shaky breath, making sure Saria was okay. The girl raced to apologize for breaking the vase because of her, while the boy who'd accidentally shoved Saria burst into tears, begged everyone for forgiveness too, and Artie jumped in to help calm the kids down, telling them not to worry, because nothing terrible had even happened. Artie stared down a massive door, frozen in place, unable to step through. Then her hand slid to her sword scabbard as she stood her ground. Suddenly, the doors blazed to life and swung open. Artie froze in shock as an unexpected voice snapped. Telling the girl to go inside, she stepped into the room and told her, "You're back." And the girl listened. Zenobia Adele Baring, one of the Council of Swordsmen, kept her eyes locked on the papers as magic oozed from her fingertip, then turned to Artie and grilled him on how it all went and whether Will Worm finally proved himself. Artie shot back that he didn't act anything like some 8-year-old and that he was wise beyond his years with strength to match. Then Zenobia Edelbaring pushed herself up from her desk, shut her eyes, and said she got it all. Then the girl spun around her desk, lost in deep thought, totally hooked on whatever was brewing. She pressed a hand to her chin, trying to crack it, while the guy who'd already been standing nearby just watched every second, eyes locked on her. Then Zenobia and Albaring cut into Artie's thoughts and told him straight up, the only guardian deity of Will Worms is the human god. Zenobia Adelbaring stayed locked in silence, then snapped her eyes to Artie and demanded, "Are you telling the truth?" Artie didn't flinch. She agreed. Zenobia and Edelbaring kept wrestling with their thoughts. Then Zenobia snapped her head up and blurted out that she couldn't stop wondering why it was happening. Artie totally didn't get what Zenobia Adelbaring was talking about, so she grilled her for answers only for Zenobia to swear it wasn't a thing, then flipped the question back on Artie like, "Got anything else?" Artie stared at the thought in her head, then snapped her hand to her chin, wondering if she had anything else to say. But no matter how she searched, that phrase just wouldn't click. She stared at Zenobia Adele's front and thought, "What's she doing?" Then noticed Zenobia Adele was sweating buckets like she was about to burst. Zenobia Adele stepped in, planted her hands on Artie's shoulders, and let out a shaky breath. "Artie, listen to me." She snapped that she didn't want to hear another question, then still asked if I'd noticed anything different about Will, like how he's been acting way too weird, almost unnatural. Artie snapped his gaze away and told her he'd already asked if she'd ever blacked out while using the measuring device. Then Zenobia and the others immediately shut off their own thoughts to process what she just said. Zenobia et al. Baring started replaying the young man's words, and it hit her like a punch. She had to rush to Milt right now. Zenobia et al. Baring told Will, "If your guardian deity is just some god, then you probably don't have a shred of abilities or magic." And then she leaned toward Artie, asking what she thought. Artie snapped through his notes and said, crystal clear, that Will was born with a gift. Zenobia Adele blinked in surprise and told Artie that if it was really like that, she had to keep a close watch on Will. Artie nodded, and then, right then and there, Zenobia Adele pulled out a wooden sword. The girl swung like lightning, then halted midair, frozen in pure momentum. You can already feel a brutal gust of wind blasting past like a warning. Zenobia Adele, Baring leaned in, and fired off one last question to Artie. "Anything else you want to ask?" Artie frowned and snapped back, "Why did that girl tell you to bring Will Worms?" Zenobia Adele Baring froze, staring at Artie, and demanded, "Do you truly get why we're doing this?" Artie shot back, We can't let riots break out. Then Zenobia Edelbaring clocked something instantly, whipped her gaze to Artie, and basically said, "That just doesn't sound believable." Artie blurted out that she was so sorry. Then Zenobia Edelbaring stepped in, waved it off like it was nothing, and told her the girl was totally right to feel that way. Suddenly, Artie blurts out something about Will Worms and the disaster monster, then asks if it has anything to do with Tin Ebrus, and Zenobia Edelbarang is hit with sheer shock. Last time, Zenobia Edelbaring straight up told her, "Keep tabs on Will," and she immediately wondered if that order was tied to the disaster monster. She went on, insisting Tenebrous isn't scared of monsters at all. She's terrified of sabotage, and that's the truth. Zenobia Edel snapped in and cut the girl off, calling her name mid-sentence. She stared at Artie and demanded to know why she decided that right now, and Artie froze mid-sentence, eyes dropping to the floor. Then the girl flat out told them the Salvation Army is built to take down cults, and honestly, she says it makes total sense. Her instincts are kicking in, because Zenobia Edelbarang ordered her to watch this boy. If he's even tangled with the gods, the cult will smell the danger and come for him, trying to destroy him outright. And now she finally gets why this hits her so hard. Artie's nerves were screaming, but she still fired off a question to Zenobia Edelbaring, who exactly was going to be her. Zenobia answered by calling Artie's name, and then she suddenly slid right up to her face. Zenobia Adele yanked her padded cap tighter, then shot back that she was lightning fast, able to lock onto what their mission was the second it clicked. She turned away and snapped that she had reasons she couldn't tell Artie yet, but she promised she'd figure it out soon enough. Artie's body tensed, but he nodded along anyway. Then she choked out her goodbye, tossed in a flurry of apologies, and slipped out of the room while Zenobia Edelbaring set her wooden sword down and mused that the catastrophes monster could, sure, be called a Tenebrous. A cult is a hidden circle of believers who crazily worship the beast of disaster, also known as the god of disasters. They're dead. Sure, they can bring the beast back to life, claw their way to the top, and maybe, just maybe, this victory is about to happen real soon. Zenobia Edelbaring is dead set on one thing. She's rushing to gather a squad of skilled warriors and anyone who can stand their ground against the beast. She pulls out a special package that measures someone's magical power, and it's strapped right to the admission application. She made it so she could track down the exact people she needed in seconds, but somehow, almost nobody fit the rules. Will Worms pulled it off, but the girl still has no clue who he really is. Right now, Will slumps in his room and lets out a deep, heavy sigh that says everything he can't put into words. He's convinced the entrance exam results don't count the number of guardian deities, and Artie warns him that once a guardian deity merges with a human, it shatters focus and leaves the person unable to concentrate. If he blows it, he can still duck back to his hometown and slip into a peaceful life again, and he'll have enough cash for upkeep and food to nurse Saria back to strength. Saria fires off questions to her brother about what went down, and when she asks if he might be hungry, Will's caught completely off guard. He nods and admits he's kinda hungry right now, and Surya tells her brother, "I'll get you food." She shoved a piece of dried meat into his hands and told him to eat it right now. Will realized she handed him the jerky his own vassals delivered to him. Back when they lived in the city, they were stuck eating nothing but bad food. So sometimes the vassals would share their food with them, except Saria. She tucked away a piece of dried meat because she knows exactly what hunger feels like, and she wouldn't let them starve. Will leaned in and asked Saria if she was hungry, but she shook her head and said no. She said she'd grab a bite to eat, but right as the words left her mouth, her stomach started growling like something was about to pounce. Will thanked his sister for the meat. Sirius cracked into a smile. Will took one bite of the meat, lit up, and told her it was delicious, watching her face light up with pure happiness. He leaned in, tried to tell her something important, and then blurted that the kitchen was packed with food. Soria's eyes widened in pure shock. Willow said she could take it anytime she wanted, and that hit her like a wave of pure shock. Will told Soraya to stop stuffing food in her pocket, and you could tell he understood because he knew that choice wasn't easy for her. Saria flashed a smile and told him she was totally fine because as long as he stayed close, everything felt safe. He realized they finally wouldn't have to starve anymore yet. The fear of Syria still gnawed at him, and he told her, "Go to the kitchen and eat." She couldn't shake the shock even after that. Later on, Syria tore into some mouth-watering food in the kitchen, like every bite was pure joy. She couldn't believe she'd get to taste food this good, but Will leaned in and told her, "Eat whatever you want seriously, as much as you want. If she stuffs herself with enough food, she'll get as strong and fast as her brother in no time." Saria dug into the food, and when she started devouring it, he wiped her mouth with a napkin and told her to slow down. Then later, Will snapped his head around and looked around. He blinked, shocked to find almost nobody around, like either the students were all gone or they'd vanished for field exercises. He realized he'd signed up too, and that's when the weird suspicion started creeping in. He swivels towards Soraya and blurts out a request for her to ask him something while she just stares back, not even letting the spoon slip from her mouth. He asks what happened after he finally got here, and Soraya clocks it. Her brother's clearly worried, so she tells him, "Don't stress, everything's fine." He even told her that sometimes he hears strange sounds that send his nerves into overdrive and he wants to know if Saria can explain what they mean. Sorry. Everyone keeps replying that she's fine, nothing bad will happen if she tells, so they pat the girl on the back and hype her up. She crushes the slime in a hug, grins bright, and swears, "Yep, I did great." Right out of nowhere, Will names the slime Fury, and Saria's jaw drops in total shock. We pet the slime, and it grinned right back at him. He stared at her for a second, and the truth hit him like a spark. She had to be insanely happy. Even though Saria used to call him Fury, and he'd started answering to it like it was normal, he wanted it clear right now. This was the real deal, and the name belonged to him for good. He told him, "Don't mess with your name anymore. Every time you do, you forget it." But at the same time, he insisted it wasn't a problem at all, and then Saria shouted for her brother. Saria launched into a tight hug with Fury and kept shouting his name over and over again. Will said the girl had called him that first, so he'd completely forgotten it. Will caught on that Fury dug his name too, and he couldn't stop thinking about every little detail of it because Will could basically feel what Fury wanted to say next. And now he's finally decided this slime's name is Fury Fury. The three of them erupted in joy, grinning like they couldn't believe it. After a while, holed up in the school dorm, Will finally says, "I'm ready." Saria shoots him a look full of hope, then knock knock, someone hits the door. Artie asked Will if she could enter his room, and Will said yes, so when she pushed the door open, her cheeks went bright red as she slipped inside. Then she leaned in and asked, "So, are you ready to go out?" Already standing face to face with Will, they talked about her coming along to the exam, Will's voice cracking with worry that he'd pull her away from what mattered most. But she smiled and said she was totally free today. Artie got slobbered on by Rune, this huge white dog, then a slug was stuck right on her shoulder, and she's left wondering whether she can boss him around as his assistant, or if she's even allowed to tag along to the exam. A slug clung to Artie's shoulder while she poked it with her finger, and then she leaned in, like, "Will, are you going to take the Rune exam?" The Rune and the slug. Will grinned and said the slug's real name was Fury. Fury, yup. That was officially his name now. Will jabbed his finger to the side, and Fury stood right beside him. Artie blurted out that she wanted Will to take the animals with him if he could, and Will nodded and agreed. Will stared at Saria. She felt his eyes locked on her, cheeks burning, then blurted his name, and Will realized he'd never left her alone like this before, so he could only pray nothing went wrong while he was gone. Will drop down in front of Saria and fire off a question: can he take the animals with him, and can she stay on her own while he's gone? Saria's cheeks flared as she nodded, saying she could handle sitting alone for a bit. Will ruffled her hair and told her he was really grateful, promising that when he came back, they'd go to dinner together. She eagerly agreed. Fury sat right on Will's head. Saria clung to Artie's hand, and Artie gently stroked Rune's muzzle. Then Artie snapped, "I'll take Saria to the nursery first," because after that, they had to rush to the entrance exam. Will, Artie, and Rune stood right in the middle of the street, packed in by a sea of people, and Artie pointed out that Will's exam would be held right here, then blasted him with a "good luck," as he smiled and thanked her for sticking by him. Will waved Artie off, and right behind him stood Danon and Ivan, two dark-haired troublemakers staring at Will while Artie sat beside him. And the guys swore Will and Artie carried themselves like they owned the place. Danon stormed up to Will, grabbed his attention with an outstretched hand, and started yelling, "How dare you ignore us!" Rune stood right behind Will, felt the danger crackling in the air, and began to growl in a warning. Around them, people started to swarm toward the shouts of those brave enough to defy the Worms family's rightful heir. Around them, people started whispering and trading theories about where those dark-haired rich heir guys came from. Then Dana snapped, overheard it all, and let out an angry laugh. He'll stare at the man in the hat who just claimed those noble family guys each have 4 guardian deities, then frown hard, realizing he has zero clue who they even are or why they're coming for him. Danon snapped, raging that he hoped Will wouldn't bolt because ending up like this would be devastating, and it would crush him if Will chickened out. Will fought to calm the growling Rune and warned that Rune could get the guys hurt. Rune kept grinding on and snarling louder and louder, while Will stood there with his back to the guys. Then one of them asked if Will was even listening to what they were saying. Rage sparked in Will's eyes as he stood half-turned and snapped at the guys, asking if they honestly thought he was a coward. Then you could see them stiffen. The moment those words hit, we flipped on them and started yelling, "How dare you call him a coward?" Then we threw insults at those guys, trash behavior, no manners, and they better shut up before they bring shame on their last name. The moment they heard that, they stumbled back, terrified. Danon's rage flared up as he started threatening Will, and Ivan stepped in, telling him to cool off. Then Ivan moved closer to Will and asked if they'd get their own divine guardian too, and Will just stared, totally lost about what he even meant. Ivan closed the distance to Will and told him, "If your deity can go toe-to-toe with ours, then you're about to face 4 of them." Back behind Will, a crowd huddled close and one guy blurted out that the four Guardians info was real after all, but it was crystal clear those guys were straight out of the Worms family. I figured I'd make my approach and told them maybe Will would hear me out anyway, so Will shut his eyes like he was about to begin and get ready to talk. The boys shoved their hands to their belts and just stood there, going dead silent for a beat. Then, out of nowhere, a wicked grin lit up the faces of the guys. He pressed his hand to his ear, turned his head, and said he still couldn't hear a thing from Will, so I leaned in right next to him and told him to ask again because Will was going to answer, one way or another. Will stepped up to the guys and snapped that if he'd already answered their question, then maybe they had some real hearing issues because his comeback left them completely stunned. One of the guys started screaming insults about Will's mother and told him to get out of town ASAP, and Will's rage instantly exploded at what he heard. Will slipped his hand behind his back, froze in place, and said nothing, while Danan went on to say Will's so terrified of being out there that he can't even make himself move. Rage burns across Will's face. He yanks his hand out from behind his back and whips it upward, and the sudden move freaks Danon out so badly, he throws up his own hands and leaps back. Will hurled the glove straight into Danance's face. Danance shrieked in pure terror. Then Will snapped that he'd never forgive him for insulting his mother. The guy just kept his hand over his face, trembling from what he'd done. Danan clutched Will's glove in both hands and snapped that Will was seriously challenging him to a duel. Then Will shot back a question: was Danan actually afraid of some 8-year-old kid with a single deity? Ivan told Will, "Say it again." Then Will whipped a second glove straight into his face and snapped that Ivan's moves were way too predictable. Ivan's body started to tremble with pure terror, and Will lifted his hand, saying those guys only know how to run their mouths, so Will challenged them to a duel. The guys snapped with rage and started insulting Will. Then Daneen's mind clicked in an instant, an evil grin blazing on his face, and he declared that since Will had given them a choice, it was time to fight, and Will was stunned by what he heard. Danan flashed a small look and told Will, "If you lose, you'll have to carry out my wish." And Will, since he never even caught the details, still nodded and agreed, leaving Danan stunned at how fast he said yes. Ivan erupted, shouting, "How can we stay calm? He's going down so easily." Will snapped his head down, shut his eyes, and rubbed the back of his head with his hand like he was fighting the urge to argue. Then Will just thought, Ivan's wrong. And with a steady breath, he stayed locked in on his own abilities. Will shot his hand up and jabbed at his own chest, declaring, "Yep, now it's my turn to call the shots." He laid out the deal. If he won, the boys would march to his mother's grave and beg her forgiveness for all the insults they threw at her, and for a moment, the boys just stared back in total silence. The next instant, Ivan flung his head back and burst into laughter, then Denon shot back at Will with a cruel smirk. No way was he winning, even if heaven and earth flipped places. Will folded his arms tight, and the boys snapped around the moment the stranger showed up. He warned that if they planned to keep this going, they'd better start the duel right now, because they might not even survive to reach the written exam. Turned out the stranger was just an adult small hat on his head, scarf snug around his neck, and he snapped that students can't duel without permission. The guy stared at him like he was hiding something. We stared at the man, and he flat out said, "No, I'm not a student." Then he snapped back that this rule hits both candidates and students. So yeah, Will has to follow it too. The Formas family members stared in shock at Will's fearless nerve. Since he didn't even flinch at their threats, then Will shut his eyes and cut the boy's words off completely. The man shot his finger into the air and declared that, since Will feared nothing and nobody, he'd make this man his duelist. Then the other guys stared at him in stunned shock. The man cracked one eye open and said he wanted in too. Then one of the guys leaned over and asked, "So what are we supposed to do about the written exam?" He'll keep brushing off everyone around him, as the man snaps back that it's getting late and the written exam can wait. Will remembers his mother's face and realizes he won't be able to sit that exam until he fights to defend her honor. Will scanned the crowd and realized that once he got into the academy, no one in his family would be able to squeeze him anymore, and after this duel, he'd finally wipe out every last debt. Around him, the other guys nodded in excitement, even willing to risk being late to the exam just to watch the fight. Will marched straight toward the Vormas family, with Rune and everyone else trailing behind, and he kept his eyes locked forward, ready to smash whoever stood in his way. A man planted himself between Will and the Vormas family, standing in that tall ceilinged room where huge columns held everything up, making it clear this was the battleground for their duel, and the fight could start right now. The guys are lined up in an arena split into sectors, while a huge crowd circles them like a storm is coming. Then the man fires off a brutal deal. If Will wins, they'll apologize to his late mother, and if the guys lose, Will stomps out of the arena and straight up admits defeat. Will shut his eyes and slid his hands down to his belt, nodding at the man's words. Dana grinned like trouble and pushed for a fight. Ivan clutched his chest with both hands and held his breath for the match to begin. The man stared at Will and snapped that it was unfair the Vormis family could lose and still walk away with nothing on the line. Will didn't even turn his head as he shot back that he wasn't bothered by how things were unfolding. So yeah, everything was fine. A rook with pure fury in his head sat on the podium, right between a girl in a raincoat and a guy in a protective suit. The man shot Will a worried look and asked if he could really deal with it. Two guys out there, and Will would be alone. Will grinned and said, I can handle it, because he definitely wasn't alone either. The man with the hat stepped up and demanded a fair fight, claiming Will was alone anyway. Then Dananx flashed a grin and said they'd been insulting the weak nonstop, so they'd take Will down even faster. Then he twisted his face, stuck out his tongue, and swore he'd take care of Will before you could even blink, only for the man to grin and say, since everyone's on board and we're ready to duel, guess we might as well start. The Vormis family's guys dropped into a crouch, striking battle poses like they were about to explode into action, while Will stood right in front of them, totally calm, totally sure he'd win. Then the man spun around, flicked his hand, and hoped the fight would be over fast. The guy began firing off wild hand swings from a half crouch while Will just stood there, locked in place, hands planted on his waist, and that sharp whistling sound of his cutting through the air. Danan shot Will a nervous look and blurted, "What are you doing?" But Will straight up brushed him off, fuming that Danan was just getting in his way with all that noise. Then Will snapped that he'd already told the guys before the fight he'd let them hit him first. The guys started hurling insults, then chanting spells. Magic symbols erupted in front of them as they stormed into battle, and the Enand warned that they'd better brace themselves to feel their full power. Will's legs crackled with magical energy, and for a split second he realized this guy wasn't just talk, he had real power. Then boom, an explosion detonated right in front of the crowd, and a giant dust cloud swallowed the whole venue. As the dust clouds finally fade, the crowd goes wild, roaring for the next surge of power. Danon stretches his arms wide and swears his strength can't be beaten, but Will storms in behind him and snaps that Danon is nothing but overconfident. Right then, Will is beside Danon, clamps a hand on his neck, and starts drilling a grappling move. One hand yanks Danon's hand in place while the other locks his neck tight. Will straddled Danon, and then bam, he started screaming, writhing, and shaking his legs in agony, while Ivan nearby panicked and shouted to his brother right away. Ivan started chanting, and glowing magic symbols flared up in front of him as he demanded Will be hit with insults. Then Will snapped around and warned that if Ivan cast magic right now, he'd end up hurting Danon too. Will clamped down on Danon's hand, and Danon erupted into screams while Ivan casually said, Will was just terrified of him. Will fired back, asking Ivan what made him think Will was scared in the first place. Danon lay on the ground, tears pouring down his face, convinced Will had clamped him down so hard he couldn't even move, because Will was still gripping him by the neck, asking why Danon didn't have the same confidence anymore. Will rode Danon and clung to him as he snarled that he could have crushed Danon in a snap, yet he just loved to torture him. Danon was sobbing for mercy. Ivan stood right there, yelling for Will to stop, because they were giving up now, and the man just shook his head. Will shut his eyes, then he let Danon go, only for Danon to crumple in the arena, barely moving, groaning in pain. Will stared him down and told him there was no reason to keep fighting. Danon trembled in the arena, arms and legs jerking as he broke down into sobs and screams, and Will stood beside him, saying he was ready to give the others a chance to recover, then they'd try attacking again, but this time, honestly. The Vormis family's boys were already lined up nearby, yanking their limbs into the dumbest little poses as they prepped magic for activation, and when I saw him, I knew he had to slam this fight shut fast, because at this pace, there was no way he'd even reach the exam. The Vormis clan members started closing in, itching to hit Will again, so Will locked eyes with them and realized this fight had to end, and it had to end fast. The Vormis children started throwing spell signs with their hands, and the onlookers instantly felt the magic Dean and Ivan were conjuring. Then the whole battlefield atmosphere turned cold and terrifying. A dark, heavy gloom clung to Ivan, and then poof, countless magically summoned insects swarmed into existence. Will stood his ground and stared at the dark cloud charging straight for him, convinced those guys must have unleashed black magic, and down in the stands, the crowd had absolutely no clue what was about to hit them. The guys shot out a whole new set of hand signals and jerked their heads at Will. You ready to keep fighting? Will stared back, felt how brutal their magic was, and decided he couldn't hesitate for even a second. Will pulled him aside and was sure he could cook up a way to beat them. But in the future, the guys were already throwing black magic around, so yeah, the others are going to have a ton of questions about it. A glowing magic ball burst into existence in Will's hand, and he stared at the guys like they were nothing, before saying they weren't a problem for him at all. Danon clenched his fist and grinned like trouble. Then he taunted Will, asking what he could possibly do with his weakest magic. So Will lunged forward and hurled his swing, smashing the magic bunk straight into the dark cloud the guys had conjured with black magic earlier. Will shot his hand up and demanded a little more time, then he threw a spell, and a blazing flash of magic detonated across the arena. Will tilted his head, grinned, and explained it like this. His power was the absorption of insects and their fiery incineration. Danan and Ivan saw Will's magic and their faces twisted with rage and shock because he just wiped it out with a single move. The Vorma brothers finally kicked off their magic. Danan thrust his hand and a magical whirlwind erupted, and then I got conjured into sharp skittering stones that lunged straight for Will. Will just stood there, stunned, realizing the earth and the wind they'd unleashed were insanely powerful. Will burst into motion, leaping and dodging every single one of the guys' magical attacks, and Denan and Ivan's nerves started to spike because none of their strikes were landing on him. Then they huddled up fast, swapping ideas for their next move to finally take Will down. We're about to dive in. He's got burning questions about these magical deities. Why would these gods pick those guys? And what's the deal? I'm a loyal disciple to the god of insects and the earth, and Danan sworn to the god of wind and earth. The grown men stared at the duel, saying Will was handling two opponents way better than anyone expected because soon the fight would end, since the other guys were running on fumes with almost no magic left to keep it going. He stared at mine and smugly decided the battle's ending was already locked in. Then a girl hurried over and asked him straight up how Will's fight was going. Ari stood before the man, yanked her scarf into place, and then he snapped. He knew her, so he dodged, sprang up, and lashed out with magic punches. Arm after arm, Ari answered. Why? Because I'm already seeing it all with my own eyes. Will's whole body blazed with magical energy, his focus razor sharp on the fight. Then the man looked at Ari and said Will had powered up his own magic flow with a spell, like a kid who somehow mastered magic that perfectly. The man brought up Will's very first capture on Danin, saying he slipped the strike, spun the move, and flattened his opponent like knocking someone down. That clean takes years of practice, yet Will pulled it off with effortless, jaw-dropping ease. The hat-wearing man cracked one eye open and declared that with the iron will behind his strength, he'd crush not just a human, but a massive beast too. Ari stared at him and listened in dead silence. Ari couldn't forget how Will saved Saria. She swore that in the rescue he snapped into action instantly, and somehow he walked away unhurt. And when the man saw Ari clocking Will's skills had leveled up even without all his big stories, it was impossible to ignore. Ari spun away from the man and snapped that she had to step out for a bit. Then the man stared her down and said she'd never care about leaving, because she wasn't about to miss the end of that fight or find out who would truly come out on top. The Vorma's children were gasping, barely able to breathe, because every last ounce of strength had just vanished, yet Will stood there like it was nothing. And the man realized the fight was already finished. We'll look at Danon and tell their guardians to be done exhausted already and they won't fight again. Danon's fury hit the moment he heard Will's words. Will kicks off his magic, his hand flares with blazing light, and he declares it's finally the right time to end this fight as clumps of magical energy surge up from above his palm. He flung his arms wide, two massive, round clumps of magic burst into the air above him. When the Vormis family saw it, their faces twisted with shock. They stared at Will and demanded, "What kind of sorcery is this? How did you mix fire magic and water magic together?" Will fired off two explosive bursts of magic at the guys, and they didn't see it coming. Then the spell slammed straight into their heads, cutting off their breath instantly. This wasn't just an attack, it was a water trap meant to catch the Vormis family. They'd herded the boys into a water trap, warned the guys, "If you don't throw in the towel, you'll suffocate in here." Will shot his hand up, and a surge of magic blazed from his index finger. Then he exhaled and told them straight. They had 4 guardian deities in their back pocket, but even that wasn't enough to beat him, so they'd better train harder. We jerk our gaze away, freaked out, where were the guys standing? Then they start gulping the water all around their heads. Will's face twisted when he spotted the boys' stuffed bellies. Then the drunk guys started bragging that they couldn't be beaten so easily, and Will realized he was about to get smashed. Will squeezed his eyes shut and told that guy not to dream. He just quit. Ending this fight was absolutely worth it. But the Vormis family stared at Will in sudden move, totally baffled by what he meant. He shut his eyes and summoned the power. Then the water started churning like it was alive, and the children's bellies began to gurgle too. Danon clutched his swollen stomach, trying not to lose it. Will planted himself with his arms stretched out, and the Vormis family guys clutched their bellies and ordered Will to hold up, because if they didn't hit the bathroom right now, they were going to burst. Will nodded and said, "Yeah, of course you have to go. You drank enough water to flood the place." Will stood before the guys still clutching their bellies and told them to own the loss and sprint to the bathroom before it got worse yet. Sweat poured down Danon's face as the stubborn crew refused to admit defeat. Danon snapped at Will that Will could end them because they'd never swallowed defeat, and Will just stood there, stunned at what those guys said. We got so nervous we blurted, "Yo, these guys are not in their right minds if they won't admit defeat." then straight up went to the bathroom in front of everyone. The Vormis family boys were so tense their teeth might have cracked then. Out of nowhere, a roll of toilet paper unspooled like a trigger being pulled. Tears mixed with spit and spilled from the warmest kids' mouths and eyes, their faces calm as a few tiny insects started fluttering over them. The crowd packed around the arena went silent, stunned by the chaos unfolding before their eyes, and they snapped that these guys had totally embarrassed themselves. Absolutely pathetic. The guys knelt there on the ground, flies buzzing overhead, and the crowd watching the fight erupted, calling them names and hurling insults at the Vormus kids. Will stared at Tanen's tear-slick face and figured he'd gone too far after all. He'd humiliated those guys in front of everyone, but then it hit him. The right thing was still the right thing, because the guys themselves kept begging for the fight. Will grabbed the boys by their shirts, tears pouring down their faces, then yanked them close and snapped, furious that the boy had no business coming near Will again, especially not around his sister. The guys' teeth chattered as fear hit them hard. Will kept the guys at arm's length and yelled that their brawl was done, then a nasty stench wafted off them. Will, gripping the guys by their shirts, couldn't believe how cruel that was when he blasted them with a terrifying magic voice. But honestly, they had it coming. The boys' faces were streaked with tears, and flies kept buzzing around them. Will snapped his head up, wondering if the boys' own deities were strong enough to actually guard them. Will clutched Ivan's shirt, and suddenly his hand blazed with magic. Ivan's eyes flooded with tears. Will shoved the guys back, dropped his head, and stared at his glowing hands like they weren't his. He couldn't wrap his mind around why any of it was happening. The man in the hat braced himself on the arena edge and asked Will if he was all right. And when Will turned and said he was fine, that guy immediately hauled himself into the arena and declared that this was the moment to finish it. The man leaned right beside Will and shot his hand into the air, roaring the results of the fight Will had just crushed, and the crowd watching erupted into cheers that kept swelling for Will's victory. Will stared the man down and blurted that he was crushed. The fight had ended like that, but he was ready to stick around and help clean up. The man opened his mouth to respond, then someone cut in and told Will to stop worrying about the consequences. Two strangers stood beside Artie, dressed in clothes stained with tears, clutching scarves tied around their necks patched with a coat of arms, and one of them demanded that Will come with them, while a faint, uneasy aura curled off both of them. One of the strangers kept staring at the man in the hat, and Will stood right beside him. The stranger snapped that the exam wasn't getting cancelled. They'd handle it, since he'd already taken control of the whole process. The man in the hat nodded and agreed. The Vormis kids just stood there, frozen, unable to snap out of it, flies buzzing around them while Will stepped in. "I'll help clean up the arena before the exam starts," he said, and Artie shot back. "Then don't worry about it, Will." She already swung it to the side, and right there stood a stone gallon beside her, promising it would scrub the entire room the second it powered on. Then Will's eyes lit up at the gallon in front of him, broom in hand. The hooded strangers told Will it was time, and with no hesitation, Will snapped around and agreed to go with them. He about started to turn when someone shouted his name, Artie. Her face went red with embarrassment as she fixed her scarf with one hand, then blurted out that Will's kindness meant the world to her. Will waded through the crowd in his raincoat, turned around with a grin, and told Artie he didn't need to thank him because it was his fault the guys trashed the arena, so he apologized for not stopping the whole mess. He lifted his hand and shouted for Rin and Fury to come over, then he invited them to follow him, and the second they heard it, they sprinted up and tagged along right behind Will. Rin and Fury tailed those two hooded strangers down the hallway, where big windows spilled sunlight into the room. Will stared at the two strangers' glowing auras, and he instantly knew they were masking their magic, yet something felt off, like they were deliberately throttling their power, so Will couldn't sense a thing. He kept staring straight ahead, his face carved into stone, thinking, if these strangers were part of some secret crew, then Artie was their student and they'd come to finish what they started, destroy the monster of the disaster. Magic snaps into motion, and a door swings open right in front of Will. He slips inside to find a room of towering windows, curtains and scarves draped with a strange coat of arms staring back at him. Will spun his gaze around the room. Swords lined the walls, flashing in the sunlight, and the moment he saw them, his gut tightened because he swore he'd seen those blades before, and he knew exactly who they belonged to. A stranger lunged at Will from behind, but when the hood slipped back, Will saw his face, tears of pure joy streaming down as he blurted that it had been ages since they had last seen the master, and Will was left totally lost, not understanding a single thing. The second stranger stood right there with his hood still up, looking completely baffled. Then the one who jumped onto Will teased that Will had somehow gotten so cute, and Will snapped back, asking to be left alone. The stranger kept Will locked by the neck and whispered that she'd dreamed of meeting her teacher for ages. Then Will's mind snapped back to those swords on the wall, the ones he'd assumed Zenobia had used, and when she finally turned, he realized the stranger was hers. Zenobia gripped Will by the neck and wouldn't let go. Tears streamed down her face. Will fought to control himself, and one thought hit him hard. It had to be her. She already knew exactly who he was from a previous life. The girl kept squeezing Will in a tight hug. Will even blurted that he thought she was Zenobia, and she lit up and told him he was totally right. Right beside them stood another man in a robe, and his face was hidden behind a dark hood like he didn't want the world to see him. He shut his eyes and demanded answers. Why'd you sprint up and hug some stranger from behind? And she reeled, totally stunned by the question. We turned toward her and said all that, but we still hadn't even seen each other's faces. He couldn't stop wondering who she wanted to meet. Zenovia's cheeks flared red, and she couldn't get a single word out. Seconds later, tears spilled down her red face from sheer embarrassment, and her words came out all jumbled, yet Will instantly clocked it as her slipping into that teacher-side intuition. Will's body tensed up, and he snapped that Zenovia should pull herself together and stop crying. The second stranger rips off his hood and declares, "All right, Will, I'll explain everything now." And Will whirls around, stunned, toward the voice, then his eyes lock on the man's face, and recognition hits him. The second stranger was Milt, blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, glasses perched on his face, and Milt leaned in and said, "It's been ages since they last saw each other." Will stared at Milton in shock, and the second Milton yanked off his hood, Will felt that same kind of magic burn in the air, like it belonged to him alone. Milton then dropped the bomb that 4 of Will's students would be serving as the president of this academy. Milt shut his eyes, then yanked a bundle of papers up in front of him and instantly said he could recognize the master, because this very bundle in his hands proved it. Milt flipped open the paper scribbles everywhere, and a coat of arms stamped right in the middle, and when he told us it was a magic package, it was slotted onto the questionnaire to measure the subject's magical power ahead of time. Will scratched his chin, deep in thought. Remembering the last time he'd filled out this exact form, now he sat at a table buried under papers, clutching a bundle in both hands. So Nobi and Milk had this package in her hands, and she told them they'd get it right away, so there'd be no doubt it truly belonged to the Master Milk. Then admitted that at first, he thought a child had been born who somehow inherited a mother's very qualities. Zenobia lifted her hand, saying the moment they heard about it, they decided to keep watch on Will. Zenobia and Milk sent Artie straight to Will, tasked with keeping an eye on him and tagging along wherever he went. Will stared at Zenobia and blurted out that Artia Zenovia's student was truly something. Then he immediately praised her, and Zenobia just said it was her job to raise a worthy student, the same way her own master had raised her. Will stared at Milt and said, "If I end up as a kid who inherits the master's gifts, I'll do the same thing, follow my teacher." Milt nodded back, and Will added he had zero doubt Milt had turned out to be an incredible teacher. Milt cradled his chin and said, "I heard the guardian deities actually worship the pillar like they're obsessed." Then he squinted as if it clicked and added, "So that's why the gods keep them so close, and when we look at MIT, I bet we'll be shocked because he hasn't changed a bit." Milton shot back to the measurement barrier's log only to find the kid was the master's reincarnation and that he was 100 an apostle, leaving Will staring in shock, wondering what apostle even meant. Will suddenly remembered what the goddess had warned him before she lifted her hand and begged him to mind his manners, reminding him he was an apostle and that he must never, ever forget it. Milt remembered what Mater used to look like, and when he mentioned a duel he'd seen, he said Mater even showed him a nasty spell that could make an enemy break loose with diarrhea, and Will just shrugged, saying he'd probably used that same horror in a previous life. Milt shot his hand out in front of him and said that the spell had just clued him in. Will was the reincarnation of the master. Will smirked and said it was a damn good reason to get to know him. Milt's stomach dropped with nerves, and he blurted that maybe they could just somehow slip past without anyone noticing. Will stood there and stared him down in brutal silence. Will grinned like a villain and swore that his past life had even more stories, so many that they'd have to recognize him. Then Zenobia slid in behind him, all sparkly excitement, and practically begged, "So can you tell me those stories?" Zenovia's face sank the moment she heard Will's tale. He swore that when she was about 5, she actually begged him to shave half her head, and as the memory hit, her cheeks burned with embarrassment as she admitted, "Yeah, that kind of thing really could happen." Zenobia grabbed Will by the shoulders and blurted out, trembling, that over 200 years had slipped by and it was time for fresh stories, but she couldn't stop herself from wondering what Will was actually doing while he was up in heaven. Milt leaned in, trying to catch every word as Zenobia and Will talked, but it all flew right past him. Will claimed the goddess had filled him in on what's happening right now, yet then admitted, with a sigh, that he was about 10 years old. Already, Zenobia snapped back that Will needed to spill everything he knew, straight from his own mouth. A few hours later, the guys were locked in at the slot. Then Will said he finally understood the tenebrous culta. Across from me, Milt leaned in and told me the truth. He and the others were rescue slots, built to take down the cult. Milk started firing off the plan now that the Beast of Calamity was dead. They had to stop it from clawing its way back to life. Even the rescue squad won't be enough, she warned, because the cult will try to resurrect it again. Milt planted his hands on his feet, bent down, and said fanatics are just ordinary people. Yet a demon sits at the center of it all, puppeteering them. Will stayed quiet, soaking in every word. He's about to unveil a monstrous horned demon because he fully believes demons are unstoppable forces, nearly impossible to bring down. Picture this, a laughing demon showing up so unstoppable that it had students doubting their own future power, because its strength was just beyond anything they could ever imagine. Milk mysteriously tipped his glasses with his hand and said that one key piece of info hadn't been confirmed before the monster finally died. Then Will snapped, wide-eyed, and demanded to know what it was. Milk started warning them that even scarier demons had shown up, and somehow they still crushed them thanks to 4 students. Will's jaw dropped at the news. Milk's mind flashed back to those images: 2 girls, a young man, and a dragon. Milt, facing Will across the table, said those demons used to be fanatics too, like the beast of disasters, until their power exploded and they slipped out of control. And Will leaned in and asked if a human could be turned into one of them. Will let out a heavy breath and admitted he'd trained hard to take down demons, but deep down, it felt impossible now. Milt grinned and said they were thrilled they'd found Will, who was already sitting right beside him, listening in. Milk leaned in and told Will they were dying to hear his stories, especially the ones about what he learned in heaven. Will grinned, totally shocked by it, because he'd been gone for 100 years and now he was finally back. Milk started smiling and said, "Time's ripping by way too fast, I'm not that young guy anymore." Hunching his shoulders, he shot back that even with Milk being 120 years old, there was no way he could look a day over 60. Milt stared at Will and said his youthful look wasn't luck, it was fueled by internal energy, so he really did look younger than his years, and then Milt's eyes overflowed with tears. Artie grinned at Milt and asked if he'd been holding back his feelings on purpose all this time. Then Milt yanked off his glasses and admitted Artie was right, because he'd been convinced he'd never meet the master again. Artie beamed and said, "For the future, I'd love for you, Will, to study at the academy, but you've gotta bury your past." Will shot his hand up and said, "I can't do anything yet. I need to pass the entrance exams first." She stared at the man in the little hat and said, "Will's skills in that fight were insane. The examiner who watched it all basically waved Will straight into the academy without exams, and Will couldn't believe it. He was left stunned by how everything turned out." Milk snatched the cup, raised it to his lips, and then snapped that he had to warn Dion and Regina. Will was here. Will blinked in shock and demanded how on earth they did even find out about him. Milt shot his hand up and a ring flashed on his finger. He grinned and said it was a summoning ring he'd forged with his own hands and he'd hand it to Will. A little later, Will was stunned because he still couldn't figure out how Milt even managed to make something like that. Will stared at Milt and raved that his power to conjure weird, incredible stuff was just top tier. Milt yanked off his glasses, wiped his tears, and melted under the compliment. Then he activated the ring and broke down exactly how to use it right. Milt began speaking through conjured round symbols packed with runes, then demanded, "Can you hear me?" And the guys answered with a clear, "Yes." Dion stood atop a shattered pillar, ruins all around and wounded everywhere, while Regina gripped a weapon with battered enemies circling behind her. Then they were all talking to the Milk, stunned as they wondered why it was calling them. Milt started to warn them. "Listen up, this is huge," because the master had been reborn and now stood there with 2 divine companions, Dion and Regina, completely stunned by the news. They begged to know if the master was about to melt, because if he was, they wanted to hear his voice right then. We'll head straight to the magicians to talk to the guys. He said he was thrilled to hear them again, since it hadn't even been a full 100 years. Dion and Regina chimed in, saying it felt like forever since they had last seen the master. Will blushed, grinned, and said he couldn't wait to meet them, then promised he'd lay out everything in perfect detail. But even as they talked, random noise kept cutting in, and the guys shot back that they were just as happy to hear from the master. He closed his eyes, flashed a smile, and told the guys goodbye, then they hit back with goodbyes of their own. Milt snapped, "Time's up," and the connection got cut off for good. Will grinned like it was proof the guys hadn't changed in 100 years. Milk was still painfully sentimental, and the second he said it, Milk's face burned with embarrassment. Zenobia was sitting right beside her. Zenobia jerked and turned bright red the second she heard a knock too fast. It was already here. She swung the door open and let Artie step inside. Every guy in the room shot to his feet, hanging on Artie's entrance. Artie burst into the room and announced she'd already finished her assignment. And Zenobia snapped back that Will would keep studying at the academy, so Artie had to stay on guard and never leave his side, which made Artie instantly blush with pure embarrassment. Zenobia swept her hand aside and declared, "Will gets to be a student and he wants the rescue squad badge." Then she warned Artie to keep a tight watch so Will didn't embarrass them. Artie just stood there, stunned that Will could slip into the academy that easily. Zenobia hooked her hand on Artie's shoulder and told her she truly believed in her abilities, so she was counting on Artie to back Will up, and Artie immediately nodded and promised to do her part. Artie mulled it over for a beat, then her face flushed with embarrassment as she blurted out that she had a suggestion. She just had to run by Zenobia, and Zenobia was all set to hear her out. Artie stood in France's Zenobia, cheeks blazing, and blurted to Will that she wanted to study at the academy. Then Zenobia stared at her, stunned. Milt and Will hovered behind Artie. As she spoke up, she'd already served as an assistant in the exam administration before, so there was nothing strange about her aiming to become a student, even after being seen in that assistant role. She shot her arms out wide and grilled Zenobia about her proposal, then sat there waiting while Zenobia weighed it in silence. Zenobia waddled up to Artie and gave her a soft head pat, then blurted out that she'd cooked up an amazing idea while Artie's cheeks flamed bright with embarrassment as she thanked Zenobia for those sweet words. Zenobia snapped her gaze to Will and asked if he was on board with Artie's plan, then Will grinned and said yes, because if this was really about keeping his identity hidden, then yeah, he could live with how things were playing out. Will strode up to Artie, grabbed her hands, grinned wide, and told her he was thrilled to keep their cooperation going. Artie lit up, smiled right back, and nodded in agreement. Zenobia planted herself in front of Artie and told her there was nothing new. No news Zenobia needed to hear. Artie snapped back that she'd already gotten the exam results it sailed through, no problems, and 30 people got selected, so Zenobia fully melted, hearing it. Zenobia shot her hand up and demanded, "Did anyone get seriously hurt during the exam?" I already knew where this was going. Then she flashed the battered, wounded looks of the Worms family boys and said, "Dan and Ivan took real damage." Will stared Artie down and demanded to know why the guys were wrecked so badly after him. Then Artie lifted her hands and assured him not to panic, because those injuries hit right after their fight was over. So, the guys all came back in jar clutched in their hands, swearing that after the showdown with Will, they'd track him down and get payback. But they ended up grabbing poisonous insects, trying to unleash them on Will, and then chaos hit. The bugs squirmed free, escaped the jar, and tore into them with painful bites. Artie remembered those guys sprawled in bed, bandages wrapped around them, and then she snapped that they were back in the hospital again because after what happened with those insects, they got wrecked for real. The referee from Will's fight told the Worms family boys he wasn't jealous of their divine guardians, but Artie warned that the harassment wouldn't stop. Those guys would keep poking Will no matter what. Turns out, the Worm family guys are standing at Pillar Zero already. Zenobia, Will, and Milt didn't expect it. And when Artie said it out loud, Zenobia and Milt immediately freaked out. Zenobia and Milt locked eyes, and Milt blurted out if the human race could even try to mess with the apostles. Then he clapped a hand over his mouth and admitted, straight face, that in his mind, the chance of getting through to those boys and the apostles was basically zero. Artie stood off to the side, completely lost as Zenobia, Milt, and Will huddled and whispered out of earshot. Wondering if the boys could actually make contact with the apostles, Will flashed back to earlier how he'd stood at the post with the ball and the thought hit him like a spark. It all happens in the God's World towering columns and a ceiling tattooed with magic symbols when a goddess steps up to Will, strokes his head, and asks why he's opening that portal again. The goddess slid away from Will, stared at him, and demanded to know why he'd come. Was he hunting answers about his close relatives, or had he been watching her this whole time? Her cheeks flared as she fell silent, thinking hard. The goddess snapped her head around, cheeks blazing red, and insisted it was all just an accident while Will drooped like a wilted leaf, clearly not buying it. The goddess shot her hand up and demanded to know why Will hadn't gotten the blessing. Then Will snapped in rage and confusion because she couldn't possibly know he'd removed it himself. The goddess replayed her earlier talk with them and said Will himself had once admitted he didn't even deserve to lay a hand on the deities, so Will stared back, saying sure, he could have said that, but he couldn't remember what reason would have pushed him to believe it. The goddess said Will was an apostle god's messenger, and Will blurted out, so can he actually do anything? The goddess snapped back to their last meeting and said that if the other gods hadn't slammed the brakes, she would have told everyone about it immediately. The goddess and Will sat on a tiny hill while other deities trailed behind them, and Will demanded, so what do these apostles look like? The goddess smiled and said she'd spill every detail the next time he came to see her. Will shot a terrifying glare at the goddess and swore everything was finally clear to him. So then why did the Worms family guys have not one, not two, but 4 deities? The goddess stiffened and a chill hit her. Will hadn't changed a bit. The goddess looked back at the faces of countless gods and said, they don't pick people by some grand rule, they just help when it's needed. Then she smiled, sighed, and admitted, and yeah, they're not even omnipotent. Will and the goddess just kept sitting there, and she leaned in to say, the paradox is right here. No matter how cursed a person seems, deities still keep them covered. Isn't that wild? Will nodded along like he understood exactly. The flicker would start to fade piece by piece until it finally vanished. Lagata even said it felt like he had to go back to his world, and he shouldn't keep coming to her. Will couldn't believe what he was hearing. The goddess's smile sharpened as she warned him, stare at me too much, and sooner or later your thoughts will tangle until you might even die. He just answered, yeah, that could definitely be a problem. The goddess slid in a few more words before he went back to his world. She was going to figure out a way to reach him and keep him out of her world as much as possible, because he still wasn't a real god yet. Will hurried back to Milton, except Zenobia wasn't alone. They were inside a weird room beside the guardian communication pillar. Zenobia stared and said Will was insanely strong. Will tried to brush it off, saying there wasn't time to explain it was all because of reincarnation. We caught up with Milt and explained it to him between these worlds. The time axis runs differently, so they couldn't stay long here. Still, that twist let him squeeze in, practice anyway. Will, Zenobia, and Milt were camped at the table, while Fury and Rune sat right beside them. Then they laid out Will's future plans, and once he wrapped up the talk, Will stood up, said his goodbyes, and headed back to Syria. A few days later, Will sat on a bench outside while Syria sprinted around, laughing as she played with the animals. Will, perched on the bench, replayed Milt's words in his head. You'll get the answer in a week, and the ceremony happens the very same day. So be ready, Will. And still, somehow, Will couldn't figure out why he wasn't freaking out. Surya swept Rune into her arms and urged Will to look her way right beside her. Fury stood tense, so when Will glanced over, he snapped that Surya better not wander too far. He thought, if I sit here on this bench, I can steal a little time with my thoughts and forget about everything. But then he spotted someone coming right toward him. Will heard whispers around him and snapped his gaze away. Then a girl in a huge dark hat and a dark suit with gloves strode right up to him, stared him down, and demanded his help, with soldiers looming right behind her. The girl grabbed Will's hand and gushed that she was so grateful for that moment in the forest when he saved her. Then Will's cheeks flared with embarrassment as he waved it off, insisting it wasn't anything special, just a simple necessity. Will stared at the girl, then introduced himself right to her face. She clasped her hands tight and said, he was from that famous Worms family. A soldier stood behind her. He cupped a hand near his mouth and coughed. The girl 10 steps still, just waiting. She snatched up the dress, then blurted out an apology for not introducing herself because she wasn't just any girl. She was Tina Dia Irmadi, the third princess of the Irmadi family. She stared at Will and said it was crucial she meet him and get to know him. Will would pull up the nearby kingdom's map and swear that Baradoa sat in the northeast, stitched to the empire of Irmati, and for a long time, Will and that empire kept things friendly. Tina beamed, then lifted one finger like she was making a big announcement. She told everyone that the teacher always gives students a middle name, and hers was... Dia Will stared for a second and said she was already worthy of praise at that age. Tina clasped her hands to her chest and declared the third princess would never sit on the throne, so she practically couldn't hold back her excitement about joining this academy on Lord Dion's recommendation, determined to soak up the best education it had to offer. Surya stormed up to Will, snapped his attention with a call, and he whipped around to face her Fury, practically sitting on her head while Rin stood right beside her. Will then introduced Tina to Surya, and the three girls traded lively greetings. Will grinned at Surya and declared, Tina's one of us now, so be nice to her. And Surya immediately stepped in, offering her hands as she agreed. Tina's cheeks flared red, and she couldn't believe Will said it so boldly. Tina stared at Will and blurted that he'd just said they were friends now because at school she had 0 friends. So the happiness hit her like a storm. She yanked her hat over her face and started shaking. Then Tina snatched Will's hands in a flash and blurted that she wouldn't be a problem for them grinning so hard because she finally got to make friends with the guys. Tina felt the soldier behind her tap in and tell her it was time to go. So she spun around and apologized, then looked Will in the eyes and said it was time to leave. Will assured her everything was okay. They'd meet again, and Tina hurried to the side where the other soldiers stood. Half the soldiers marched up to Will, slammed their hands to their chests, and bowed hard like he was royalty. Will stood right there, Surya, Fury, and Rin at his side, staring in stunned disbelief at how far they went. The soldiers snapped to attention and charged after the fleeing Tina, who whipped her head toward Will and the others and waved them in. Will locked onto the soldiers' faces for a second, like they triggered a memory, and his gut told him, I've seen you before. Surya froze in shock and asked if he was okay. Will just gave her a quick answer. Everything was fine. Will ruffled Surya's hair and grinned, telling him they could keep playing, and Surya lit up at the idea. Then they noticed someone lurking behind a nearby tree, a girl with tattooed ears, and once she stepped out, she revealed she recognized Will. Will sat across from Artie, and she gripped a gun like it was the only truth in the world outside. Trees lined the street, and their leaves drifted down while the boy stood there. Sorry, there she was. On a bench, Fury packed under her head. Will and Artie stayed locked in, eyes sharp, bodies ready to kick off the fight. Will and Artie froze in fighting stances, staring each other down, while Surya stayed sprawled on the bench with Fury on top of her, snoring low until Surya started to squirm and toss like something was crawling under her skin, but Fury didn't budge and kept on sleeping. Will stared at Artie with a stone-cold serious face, and she stared right back like the stakes were personal. Then Artie hoisted her sword over her head and charged at Will first, screaming as the blade came straight for him while he tightened his focus until nothing else mattered. Will grabs already. She rocketed upward with both hands, sword hovering as if it had a mind of its own. Then pure shock shock hit her like a punch. Will gripped the sword with both hands and it trembled in his grasp. Artie snapped that he better not drop it. Then Will shoved the blade forward, pushing her aside as Artie lunged in close and tapped her on the shoulder. Will yanks Artie by the shoulders and hurls her over him. She jerks her mouth open as pure shock hits in midair. Artie snaps down on his feet, then plants one hand on the floor to steady his balance. Artie doesn't even get a second to breathe. Her own sword snaps into view. The sharp tip jammed inches from her face, and she's stunned into silence. Will grips her blade while she stays on her knees, telling him, straight-faced, that she's ready to quit. The sword flashed like a blade of sunlight, glittering hard. Will thrusts the blade into Artie's hands, and Artie admits that after the battle, everything clicked. She finally understands why her teacher calls Will the Master. Will smirks and fires back that Artie isn't the only one who knows how to swing a sword. Will steps in front of Artie and grins, saying he can finally claim they truly got a full workout in. Then Saria jolts awake, yawns like crazy, and clamps a hand over her yawning mouth. Saria wiped sleep from one eye while her other hand kept patting Fury as he yawned. And then she told Will, "I'm already awake." Saria stared at the guys in shock and said, "I'm so happy you brought Artie back because the moment you played without me, I missed everything." Then Artie and Will both froze as they noticed the red heat on Saria's face. Saria slid a hand to his belt and told Artie it was time to go. And Artie shot back that it was time for her to leave too. Saria's words hit and Artie instantly got upset. Saria yanked Artie by the sleeve, eyes brimming with tears, and begged her to stay just a bit longer and play. Then Artie flushed and said she could, but only for a short time. The wind rattled the treetops, and before anyone knew it, a whole week had flown by then. Crowds poured into the booth, desperate to get the answers from the entrance exams. Will stood at the very back with Surya, Fury, and Ren at his side, pretending to stare at the crowd because he swore he already knew his results and didn't want the other students to sniff out his secret. Saria shot her hands up and asked Will if his name was on that stand. Then Will went bright red, mortified that people would see it there for ages. Will stared at the stand and realized Ivan and Dan's names weren't anywhere on it. Then a voice called out to him, and Will snapped around, startled that it was his own name. A girl with wild, animal-like ears burst in front of Will, one hand gripping a girl who looked just like her. Then she shot her other arm up and announced, "I'm Rosetta." The other girl standing beside her, her sister Rosa, and that's when the roll slipped up from behind Rosette like it was ready to strike. Rosa lunged into Saria's arms, and they reunited like it was destiny while Will stood there beside her, stunned to the core, because he had no clue how those girls even knew each other. Rosa and Saria were holding hands, grinning like they owned the world, and Saria said she'd played with Rose before then. Will cut in, grinning too, saying he got everything and swearing he'd met the girls today. Will stood face to face with Rosetta and told her he was truly grateful she was looking after her sister. Then Rosetta squeezed her eyes shut in embarrassment and mumbled that she was just happy to meet new friends and make them. Rosetta shot her hands up, cheeks blazing, as she announced she'd crushed the entrance exam, so she'd be starting at the academy this very year, and Will lit up, saying, "That's amazing news." He winked with one eye and told him straight up that it was her stalking him yesterday. Then Will's words made Rosetta look wrecked, all tangled up and bright red with a blush. She couldn't believe Will had her totally figured out. And when she asked, he said he didn't feel threatened at all, so there was nothing for him to worry about. Rosetta scratched her head, nerves spiking, and blurted that hearing him talk to the princess had her worried. Then she apologized for how she acted. He shot back that she shouldn't apologize because he would have done the exact same thing in her shoes. Will offered Rosetta his hand and said, "If our sisters are friends, I'm sure we'll click too," and Rosetta nodded right along. Then the two of them shook hands like it was the happiest thing ever. Saria and Rosa took turns roasting Will, and Rosetta Will grinned and glanced at the girls, while Rosetta folded under their teasing, blushing all over as she begged them, "Don't embarrass me," and Fury and Rin kept on yapping and causing trouble. The day of the dedication ceremony finally hit, and crowds poured into a huge building lined with towering columns, while in a packed hall everyone settled in to hear the leaders talk. Only then did Princess Tina, the third princess, step forward and read from a book. I ate the briefing for freshmen in the classroom, watched our teacher slap symbols onto the blackboard, and saw everyone sink into their seats and lock in, listening hard. Then they all crashed into a big general meeting. Will and the others finally met face to face and started bonding over drinks. Will held Saria tight in his arms, Tina stood right beside him, and Artie sat there, gently stroking Saria's head. Then lunch break hit, and right at the room's entrance sat a carved plaque shaped like a loaf of bread and wheat ears. Will and the whole crew, with the animals all gathered around, sat at the table and dug into their meal while Rosetta clutched her glass and swore her village had been hit by a demon, so she needed to catch it. But she couldn't do it alone, and Will sat right across from her, locked in and listening every word. Rosetta flattened her ears, a tear slipped down, and she admitted it. Her guardian isn't a warrior god at all. He's the god of hunting. So yeah, She's barely trained for martial arts, and her deity is about as useless for fighting as it gets. Will stared at Rosetta and blurted, "I'm in. Let's hunt that monster." Because he refused to leave a friend hanging, Rosetta clenched her fists, lit up with joy, and thanked him with all her heart. Rose lifted a spoonful of food to Soraya's lips, then glanced at the girls as Will snapped that if they were hunting a demon, they'd better form a team that could swing magic and steel side by side. After a while, Tina burst in front of Will, gripping a magic staff, while a sword and a scabbard sit tight on her belt. Will stood in front of Tina, with Rosetta right beside him, and Will told her that Rosetta had probably already met the girls that Tina had brought. She praised them like they were legends. The best swordsmen and magicians around Tina's nerves shot through her as she blurted that Will was just hyping her up too much. Will stood there staring at Tina, Rosetta, and Artie, thinking they'd finally formed the perfect crew: one swordsman, one hunter, one magician, and a healer. Artie pressed a hand to her face so only Will could hear her whispers, then told him Zenobia had given them the green light, meaning they could finally slip out of the academy's walls safely. Will thanked her. Rosetta's ears perked as she wiggled them, and she volunteered to go first. Rosetta and Tina practically burst into the air, yelling that they had to smash that demon as fast as possible, and right behind them, Will stood with his hands on his waist, grinning like he'd seen this coming, while Artie stood behind me, completely blank, like he felt nothing. Birds burst from the leafy treetops as the wolf's body tore clean in half, then a hooded stranger stepped out of nowhere, face hidden, clutching the spine and skull of a skeleton in his hands. The demon's already hunting for willpower inside his own team, and then right from under that hood, another stranger's face rises into view, except it isn't a face at all. It's a skull packed with razor-sharp teeth. The boys marched through the forest near the palace. Will charged ahead, already leaving the others behind. While Rosetta and Tina slid right between them, Tina walked along, humming and singing her song like she owned the whole place. Tina gripped her magic staff, beaming and singing like she meant it. Then Will strode in, smiling at her. That smile hit so hard she blushed and whispered that Will looked unbelievably happy. Tina trailed behind Will with her tongue poking out like this was just another buddy walk, and Will kept moving, grinning the whole time as he said he got it, he was happy, just like Tina. They jogged past a massive, sprawling tree. Tina kept right on their heels and told Will, "If anything happens to us, I'll patch up every wound. I'm a real healer." Then Will spun around and said, "We're counting on you, Tina." Will asked Tina if she could heal wounds, and then he realized her guardian was the god of water. Tina smiled and told him he was right. Tina shot up 2 fingers and declared she still had a squad of guardians. Thunder, air, fire, and ice. Will stared at her, stunned, because he'd counted 8 pillars, including the human god. Tina started fidgeting and waving her hands, blurting that even people like Will could pull off feats with just one guardian deity, and Will promptly left, telling Tina to stop praising him like that. Will stood face to face with Rosetta, threw his arms wide, and announced she'd just been granted a guardian, the god of hunting. Rosetta stared him down and nodded, agreeing with every word. Rosetta slung a bow across her back, glanced aside, and said she could handle it and she could spot any creature's tracks so they'd find the demon fast above the treetops. A bird suddenly tore through the sky. The kids were hemmed in by trees and scraggly shrubs, and Rosetta shot her hand out, pointing hard to the side. She said, "From right here, you can see the village." Will and Tina strode up to Rosetta and stared out into the distance. And Rosetta told them, "The villagers here make their living by hunting and selling sheep." Then she grinned and said, "This is the kind of place you'd love to live." Will just smiled right back and nodded along. The boys stood atop a tiny hill, and from there, they could map the entire village, houses snug together and crop plots stretching out like a promise. The villagers looked exactly like Rosetta, ears and all, and their arms were tattooed too, while one person was out in the herbs and another was tearing into construction work. Rosetta strode right up to them, lifted her hand, and beamed as she greeted the villagers. Then the tattooed man and the woman beside him instantly recognized her. Rosetta edged toward the villagers, and the resident immediately grilled her, like, why'd she come back so fast, and how could she have flunked the exam? She just flicked her hand and snapped back that she'd passed everything, then marched straight into the academy. Rosetta scratched her head, mortified, as the villagers showered her with praise and cheers, and when she stepped into the academy, she swore she was the pride of their village. Meanwhile, Will and the girls stood right behind her, thinking they'd finally landed back in Rosetta's hometown. Rosetta jerked her finger at the guys and said, "Come on, my friends and I are going to introduce you to the villagers." Rosetta rolled up with Will, Arditha the swordsman, and Tina the healer, then introduced them to the villagers, and the guys lit up with excitement to finally meet the people from Rosetta's hometown. They bowed deep, showing respect for the new friends they just made. An elderly villager marched up to Will, grabbed his hand, and shook it hard, saying he was thrilled Rosetta had friends, and Will just kept smiling back as the handshake went on. Rosetta threw her arms wide and called out to the villagers, declaring they'd come to wipe out the demon. Then the whole crowd stared at her and erupted in cheers. An elderly man stepped up to Tina and told her they'd already reached out to the guild for help, so when the adventurers showed up, he couldn't stop thanking them. Tina lifted both hands, smiling, and said she was happy too, because she was Rosetta's friend. He'll turn to an old man and demand to know everything about the demon that slaughtered their village. Then the man nods and agrees to spill the truth. He replayed in his mind that first showdown with the demon, the very first villager who crossed paths with it. He swore the demon showed up right in the pastures while he was out grazing his sheep, and he didn't even realize it was standing there in front of him until it was too late. The man started piecing together what came next, and the tale hit harder when he spotted the demon. He bolted toward the village in pure terror, yelling for the sheep to follow, but the demon swarmed in, dragged off a ton of them, then trampled their crops and wiped out the entire harvest. After hearing the demon's tale, the boys stormed out of the village and raced back to the spot where they first laid eyes on it. Will crouched by the tree. Rosetta scanned the footprints, and then she spotted something big, calling the guys over like, "Come look at this." Rosetta crouched and pressed her hand beside a massive footprint in the dirt, and she said it looked exactly like a demon bear had left it. Then the guys froze, stunned by how huge that print was. Rosetta dropped into a squat and stared at the bushes, insisting the trail ran that way. The guys figured the demon might have slipped back to his lair, but they had to chase these tracks then. Little by little, the sky started to darken. A little later, the heroes stumble into a tiny clearing and spot a small dark cave ahead. Then someone blurts that they think they found her, and the moment everyone looks closer, it's confirmed the tracks stop right at that cave. The boys kept huddled together in the bushes by the cave, and Rosetta pointed in, saying their target was inside. Then she turned to Tina and fired off a question about what she was really doing. Tina froze in shock, mouth hanging open as amazement hit her. Like lightning, she started drawing out a long, nervous sound like she was about to burst into speech. Then the girl whipped around to her team and asked, "Do you think we can pull off magic?" Tina didn't get what she meant and blurted out, "Wait, what are you talking about?" Will grinned like this is exactly what Tina would do. Because her plan actually has a spot in all this too, Tina just awkwardly scratched her head and smiled anyway. Then Rosetta said, "Once that demon bursts from the cave, we'll pin it down with my bow and Tina's magic." Tina grinned and told the team to trust her. Then Rosetta pushed forward and said Artie would step in and slash the demon with her sword. Artie nodded and swore she got it. Rosetta also warned that Will would be right there if anything went sideways, and Will agreed. Then the whole group huddled up. Rosetta checked, "You ready?" and kicked off the countdown. Later on, the operation finally kicked off. Tina shot her finger up, poured out magic power, and conjured a magic ball straight above her head. The girl blasted a massive fireball straight into the demon's cave, then blurted, all awkward, that she'd maybe gone a bit too far and needed to shrink it, because if she didn't, that big fire wasn't just a joke. Suddenly, a brutal roar tore through the air, and the girls snapped around in shock. Then a massive bear launched out at them, so huge it made Tina's stomach drop. The beast kept stalking forward, snarling like it owned the battlefield. Tina and Rosetta froze in pure terror as they faced the monster, and when Rosetta blinked and opened her eyes, she managed to say it was just huge, while Tina shut hers tight and let out a scream that ripped through the room. The next second, it was already happening right between the girls as they yanked their swords from their scabbards, and a brutal slash rang out. Artie was right on the monster's heels. Her sword flashed in the light, and the demon bear just stalled, stuck in that terrifying pose. Artie slid her sword back into its sheath with a soft click and announced, "We're ready." Right then, the demon bear smashed down with a deafening crash. Tina shot an embarrassed look at the guys, apologized fast, and admitted she was so terrified she got totally rattled after seeing just how huge that monster was. Tina leaned in and told Artie how insanely cool he was, praising the way he gripped the sword like he owned the moment. Then she hyped Artie up as great. Rosetta chimed in too, saying she had sharp eyes and was always paying attention, but she still couldn't spot him at all until Artie handled the whole situation in the blink of an eye. Will thought right on cue, just like a student of his. Then Artie stared at the demon bear sprawled nearby and said, amazed, that this thing was a mountain of muscle. Rosetta's eyes went wide at what he said. She strode up to the demon bear, threw her arms wide, and backed Artie up. Yep, the girl was right. It looks like that fur is super thick, but it's actually paper thin. Right when the girls got focused, Will snapped their attention. He told Rosetta to stop, rubbed his chin like he was thinking hard, then asked if that demon bear really didn't chomp sheep in huge numbers. Rosetta muttered that it sounded way too strange, so she took off to check the cave. Will snapped around to Artie and told her they'd check everything around here. While Artie and Tina handled the bear, Rosetta leaned in and told the girl, "You can use my knife, it's as razor sharp." Artie nodded and said she got it, then grabbed the sharp blade. After what felt like forever, Will and Rosetta finally burst out of the cave, and Will spun to Tina, apologized, and admitted they'd been stuck in there for ages. He shut his eyes and muttered that it was messed up no bones, No fur, not a single trace in that cave. Like something erased the whole sheep, maybe a totally different demon snatched it, and he couldn't stop thinking about that massive claw. Rosetta stared at the bear's carcass and snapped that they'd better find another demon fast, or it would go on and eat someone else. Then she stepped up to the body and told the girls they'd done an amazing job, and Artie immediately asked what they were going to do with it. Will winked and told her he'd take the bear straight to Rosetta's village. Then the girl gasped so hard she blurted out in shock. Will stared at the girls and said he figured the bear carcass would be the perfect payment for the damage. Then he asked what they thought. Tina immediately backed him and called him her friend, and Ella chimed in too, saying she didn't mind. Then Will snapped his gaze to Rosetta and asked, "Are you okay?" Rosetta looked stunned, but right away she broke into a smile, tears shining as she thanked the guys for everything they'd done. Will shouted that the girls should grab everything and haul it back to the village, letting the residents decide their next move, until he noticed the fur was huge and weighed a ton. Rosetta snapped back that they can only carry the fur because the meat might be poisoned by the demon, so they've got to dump the meat fast. Tina pushed for us to spark our own fire instead of leaning on magic, and right in those flames, you can sear the meat. Then Will jerks his head up and pure fury explodes into view. In the next heartbeat, fury ripped out of Will and bolted to the side. Will lunged with a hand outstretched and yelled after him, but he instantly knew he couldn't keep it. Fury leapt straight into the butchered demon bear's body, and in the next heartbeat, it ballooned bigger, then started tearing into and devouring what was left of the carcass, leaving a bunch of guys stunned. Will had no idea Fury could pull something like that off, so he just stared, totally lost. Rosetta and Artie kept their eyes locked on the chaos. Then right in that instant, the demon bear's body started breaking apart and melting into Fury like it was never separate. Will and Rosetta both went wide-eyed, stuck in pure amazement. Rosetta's jaw dropped as she watched the meat melt away into Fury's body, and she blurted that it was vanishing before her very eyes. Rosetta and Tina stared at the tiny Fury, yet all that was left were scraps of fur and fangs, and Rosetta couldn't believe it. Then Fury spat something out, and Tina's eyes widened as she realized those weren't random bits at all. They were what got processed from his food inside his body. Fury awkwardly hovered beside that dark mass, and Rosetta joked it looked like hummus, while Tina couldn't believe something like that could even happen inside Fury's body. Tina wrapped Fury in a hug and gushed that, yep, Fury was the sweetest little slime in the world. Then Rosetta spun toward Tina and Fury and started blasting out harsh words, mouth open wide like she was about to explode. Rosetta snapped her gaze toward Will and started yelling that the slime could just gobble up the bear demon like it was nothing, even though she wasn't convinced, and Fury was a whole new species anyway. Will rubbed his cheek and admitted he didn't really know what Fury could do. Will whipped around to Rosetta and said, "We're going now." They had to sweep the whole pasture again, not missing a single clue, because maybe they'd overlooked something last time. Rosetta nodded and promised, "I'll go with you, Will." After a while, the crew finally hits the pasture and they know they're in the right spot because the fence by the forest is busted wide open. They stare at that broken gate and swear the demon bear came crawling out of it. Rosetta dropped beside the trail and said the sheep's tracks were right here, and the demon's prints lined up too. Then she shot back to her feet, announced they all came from the other side, and told the team to fan out and search. A little later, the team plunged into a deep, shadowy forest. Then Rosetta froze, spotted something, and blurted that this place had something seriously interesting waiting for them. She jerked her head up, shock on her face, and asked, "Already wolves? Are they demons too?" Will answered, "Turns out the sheep got nabbed by wolves, not a demon bear." Then Rosetta snapped back, "If they're acting as a pack, they've teamed up with that bear to steal the sheep." Rosetta clapped her hand over her mouth and gasped that the tracks were still fresh, meaning they were leading somewhere, and hunting sheep wouldn't be hard at all. So she made the boys stare at the prints. They were identical, like the whole flock was moving as one. But how could that happen without a shepherd? Then Rosetta spotted something incredible about the 11 tracks and blurted it out. Will froze in shock, called it impossible, and immediately grilled her. Did she miscalculate, or did she somehow slip up and make a sudden mistake? Rosetta bragged that she'd nailed every calculation, then told the team to keep following the tracks because they apparently led straight into that cave. Rosetta then shot back that there were no wolves in sight. No, the sheep had come here all on their own and slipped into hiding from the demons, and we'd asked the others if that story could even be true. Rosetta insisted. Sure, they might not believe it, but they couldn't have wandered in here by themselves. Tina snapped back that she trusted Rosetta, and Artie jumped in with, "Same here." Rosetta gave a nervous little smile, then thanked Artie and Tina. Then the girl strode up to the cave and said she'd go take a look, but in the blink of an eye, she snapped her gaze to the side and froze in shock. In the next heartbeat, a brutal beast slung Rosetta aside like she weighed nothing. Rosetta yelped and shot up into the air. Will snatched her in time, blurted out if she was okay, then immediately turned his gaze away. The guys glanced over and there it was, a tiny goat. "There's more," Rosetta said with a grin. Tina whipped her head to the side, pointed, and told the group to follow. Behind that little goat, sheep packed in tight 8 of them, then suddenly 10. Will swore he could tell it at a glance. The tracks of the 11th were from that tiny goat. Rosetta shot her hand out and declared, loud and proud, that she'd never mix up a sheep's prints with a goat's. That goat bleated loud, and we turned to see it for ourselves, asking, was it really guarding a whole flock of sheep? Rosetta stared in shock, because this tiny goat was holding off an entire herd. Will grinned and told them they'd come straight to take down the demon bear for the village, and by the end, they'd wiped out the threat and hauled off every last sheep, all because of that goat. Now Will wants to keep the goat for himself, and the goat enthusiastically agrees. Will throws him a grateful nod, and Tina just stares, shocked that Will is actually talking to a goat. Will learned the kid's name was Kiki. He'd stayed with the sheep for a whole week, keeping them safe and driving off the wolves, and when trouble still came, they bolted into a cave to hide from the predators. Every day, he charged in and defended the herd from those monsters, and now he's damn proud he stayed and helped. But man, he's starving. If he can actually understand what that goat is saying, then he's no ordinary animal, he might be a divine beast. And right then, the girls stood shoulder to shoulder beside the goat. Tina gushed that Kiki was amazing, and Rosetta immediately wanted one for herself too. Suddenly, the wolves started howling, and the guys snapped to attention. Will and Rosetta burst out of the cave expecting just one, but a whole pack stood right in front of them, and Will realized they'd completely surrounded them. The goat came charging into battle, then he snapped to action, tried to stop him, and demanded he wait. The fight erupted fast. He rammed head on and slammed those wolves apart, sending them flying in every direction. Rosetta's eyes widened when that baby smashed the target dead on. Then we'll say the wolves were terrified, so they'll fall for it and act. Rosetta snapped an arrow onto her bow, Tina ignited her fire magic, and Artie ripped her sword out as Will hurled magic straight into his fists. After things cooled down, we'd quiz them. Did you really wipe out every last wolf? Rosetta nodded and swore they were everywhere, counting the packs by the footprints they'd already stumbled across in the forest thicket. Tina said they'd taken down the demon bear and wiped out the wolves and somehow saved the sheep too, which meant they'd won for real and their friendship power was stronger than ever. Now they had to tell the girl to wait, because they still hadn't delivered the sheep to the village yet. After a while, the guys bolted into the village, and when the villagers saw the sheep safe and sound, joy erupted everywhere. They begged them to stay, but the guys smiled, thanked everyone for the hospitality, and hurried off because Saria and Rosa were waiting for them back at the academy. After a little while, Rosetta thanked the team for stepping in, and Tina waved it off, telling her not to stress since they'd had a blast, and hey, they were friends. Will munched on the treats and raved that the souvenirs were gorgeous. Then Tina spun to him and asked, could she snag some goodies too, or did she not deserve them? Will tells Tina she absolutely killed it, and that she deserves that cookie as much as anyone, so he hands her one. Tina bites in, says she'll give it her best if Will thinks it's great, and then she's like, oh wow, these cookies are seriously tasty. At that time, the cult was keeping a close eye on them. Then the leader snapped his finger, and his followers were ordered to wipe out everyone. Tina sat near the tree, slumping as she told everyone she was wiped out, while Will stood tall, staring at her, and declared they hadn't gotten a real rest since they left the village. The boy told her they could head back and rest if she wanted, but Tina turned around with a heavy shake of her head, insisting Rosa and Surya were waiting. So the girl pushed for one thing, going home ASAP. Rosetta stared at this kid like she'd missed something, and then turned to Ula, demanding to know what they were going to do with him because the kid wasn't even scared of wolves. Like, he didn't just fear them, he felt more like a monster. Will said he had nowhere else to go, so he brought the kid with him. Like, it didn't feel like a burden to take care of him at all. Rosa's grin lit up as she watched, and the boy was already sitting up, calmly stroking the goat. Suddenly, Will got pulled toward something, froze for a split second in a daze, then snapped his head toward the noise, only to spot a blazing fireball lighting up the sky. He blurted a wild shout at the girls, then spun to Artie and called everyone over, and right after that, boom! An earth-shaking explosion tore through the air as a huge cloud of smoke blasted up into the sky. Turns out, Will didn't have a real shield at all. He just held up a smoke screen and called it protection. Up front, he was gripping the shield, while Rosetta, Tina, and Artie sat right behind him. Will snapped that it all went down in the blink of an eye, and honestly, they were lucky they found a way to duck out of that blast, while Artie just grinned and said she'd pick the spot right next to them because it felt like the safest place. A whole swarm of demons with different masks poured in around the blast, standing guard in front of the guys, closing them in from every side like a living wall, and those guys. They stood back to back, shoulder to shoulder, ready to fight. Will just stood there, dead serious, completely clueless about who they were. Then Artie swung around and said, we're cult exterminators. The moment the guy processed it, it hit him like, wait, could it be me? And Tina gasped in pure, terrified shock. Tears burst down her cheeks as she remembered her friend battling the cult exterminators and how, in the middle of that fight, her friend vanished. He snapped his face toward Tina, and it hit her like a jolt. Her cheeks flamed as she froze, totally stunned. Then the guy whipped around with a huge grin, told her everything was fine, and begged her not to worry. He kept pushing the idea she only had to use her magic, and then he insisted they must have been demon wolves in human skin. Tina steadied herself, took a breath, and nodded along with the guy. Meanwhile, Rosetta hurled arrow after arrow at the cult exterminators, but she could barely keep it together. Right then, Tina shrieked, snapped her arm up, and launched into the fight, already realizing just how fast and agile those cult guys were. Rosetta reached out to Will because she needed answers what now, and Will was stuck on the same idea as his old self. They had to track down the source of magic. Right then, a brutal gust slammed into Will so savage the storm ripped through the forest, chopping every tree into neat round logs, and before she could even warn him, Will shot back. "I'm fine. Everything's fine." The light was blinding, and he couldn't see a thing, so he snapped a lightning flash spell, and every cult destroyer beside him shot up into the air, while a harsh, blinding glow wrapped around those demons. But they could only destroy that magic because it had spread everywhere, no hiding it, no holding back. Rosetta's face went stone cold as she said they'd crush them with one spell, wiping out the Annihilators, and still, Rosetta and Tina couldn't wrap their heads around what was wrong with those two demons. Artie didn't joke he swore they were still alive, so the girls had to brace themselves fast because once the Annihilators lost their leader, they started to spiral into confusion. Yet these two demons kept marching forward anyway. Rosetta had to be sure Tina was ready, so she checked and nodded, and the next second, a sword flashed into their hands. Rosetta clutched her bow at full readiness, Artie gripped his sword, and Tina raised her staff then. At last, the girls let out a huge breath of relief after they crushed the last of the destroyers. Will hurried over to Tina to make sure she was okay, and she flashed that nervous little smile that basically screamed, "Yeah, I'm fine," because honestly, they'd done a great job with her, and Tina was already praying they'd just leave. Still, the guy only managed an awkward, nervous line about how they were so tenacious. Tina stammered that they'd finally gotten their revenge, right then, a demon lunged forward and thrust a hand toward her to strike. The destroyer snapped a seal into existence and drove it straight at the guys, and when it hit, his grip vanished from the demon's hand like it had been wiped clean. With a brutal shriek, the demon launched into the sky, flung up by a grinning goat that didn't care as it started to bleed. Will's cheeks burned as he stared, wondering if that guy was even alive, while Rosetta stood behind him, stunned, speechless. Will looked like he'd been smashed by a kid's swing, and honestly, it was brutal to watch. Then Rosetta burst into wicked laughter, showering the kid with praise like he was absolutely incredible. Artie snapped to it. The cult exterminator wasn't moving at all. Will froze in shock, and at the exact same moment, the demon sprang up from his seat, the mask blasting off his face. The guys were baffled he should be gone by now, but the destroyer's clothes started ripping apart, and Artie screamed, "Back off," before yanking her sword. The exterminator swelled into a super muscle monster, his arm ballooning to several times its size as he ripped Artie's sword clean in half. In the blink of an eye, she shot up with anger, but her relief hit too because he finally showed up. Then the demon flashed that terrifying grin and growled like a nightmare. And right then, the devil himself rose up in front of the guys, muscles bulging like they were about to snap. He couldn't stop himself from thanking them, because he only got to be reborn thanks to every single one of them. He'd already faced a demon before, and yeah, he'd fought evil spirits in his past life too, but somehow, he totally missed the part where the devil gets reborn the instant the vessel vanishes. But right now, Will was trapped in the skinny body of a little kid, and the girls beside him were mortified by his total inaction, so she snapped her attention to him. Then that guy blurted into action and charged straight at the devil, because he refused to back down and decided to attack anyway. Because he was flying forward, a brutal gust ripped in behind him, then the devil erupted into laughter as a guy's foot rocketed straight into the boy's head, but the devil's skull was like stone, way too tough to crack, so the demon yanked the boy's leg and growled, "Giving up isn't that easy for you." The cult's leader clamped down on his leg with brutal force, grinning like a nightmare as he swore he'd crush his will like a bug because that childish curiosity had just played him for a fool, and the victim didn't even realize what was coming next. The devil barked from the shadows in an underground roar, slammed Will straight to the floor, and promised he'd turn him into mincemeat in seconds. Tina shrieked, panicked for Will, and immediately begged me to help her. Attack streaked toward the devil, and that only ignited his fury. He snapped, calling them already stupid. She hurled more assaults, but her strength nearly ran out, and the devil just laughed harder, saying it wouldn't change a thing, as his eyes darkened to the black of night. He spun back to Artie with a grin, smugly thinking she believed that if she sliced him in half, the whole thing would be finished. Right then, the devil snapped his gaze to his own hand and froze in shock. because the limb was nowhere near where it should have been. Will, standing right behind him, wasted no time with skin as tough as it was. It could still be cut. Right now, his body felt like it was running on fumes, and the girls burst out, cheering his name with pure joy. Will figured they'd finally end him, then the devil grabbed his hand and just sat there like it made sense, utterly confused that he could pull it off, and even more confused about what Will had done, because rage was burning all over his face. Will grinned with that same cocky confidence and said, "I just learned. I'm just as mortal as you." And the devil's smile vanished as rage boiled, teeth bared, growls tearing out of its chest. A devil sprouted a hand and snapped at the boy to quit acting arrogant, because in every way that mattered, he was stronger, and now he was about to tear them all down. At that exact moment, the monster's head snapped off and sailed sideways, yet its vicious grin still clung on while Will clutched a lightsaber, blasting out a savage gust of wind from the strike. Will spun toward the girls, and a jolt of fear hit him because they just stood there, totally clueless about what went down. The devil crumpled behind them. Tina and Rosetta stared at Will, amazed by how he handled it, and he gave them a modest nod and a quick thank you. Artie snapped in frustration that he'd just wrecked her as a swordsman and that he'd probably start panicking, get embarrassed, and apologize until Tina suddenly spotted something. The devil's body started warping out of shape like it was getting melted, and then we realized what was happening. It was dissolving into liquid, with steam blasting out from where it got cut. He slid up to her because he figured she might know what it was. Artie didn't have a clue, and she didn't think it sounded good at all, so the guy kept wrestling with the meaning in his head. He hit them with freezing magic, but he still figured he needed to get frozen, because right in front of my eyes, that demon kept melting anyway. Then the guy went for thunder, followed by fire and wind, and each one fizzled out until he finally slammed the water at it. And right then, it clicked. His water magic was actually hitting home. The monster looked smaller, and the spots where the water turned black were spreading fast, like proof it was working. And Tina confirmed it. This was exactly the sign everything was on track. So he pushed forward right as the devil started sizzling and shifting forms. Then crack, a plate shattered, and there was Saria sitting in the kids' room. A random girl asked if she was okay, then Saria blurted that her plate suddenly cracked in half, and the poor babysitter freaked out, terrified and panicking. She figured Saria must have been hurt, and guilt crushed her because this happened at all. So the girl gently cupped Saria's cheeks and whispered, shaky and crestfallen, that she was fine. Turns out, Saria wasn't alone. She spotted her brother. He soaked to the bone and stayed grim. Then she caught a glimpse of his past life. His whole world flipped, because instead of her brother brawling with someone, suddenly her brother sprouted wings. Saria's eyes widened because he wasn't just standing there. He was a tenebrous, right in front of her. It felt like someone lurked behind him, their 4 wings casting a ghostly reflection. Now it was time for the guys to take down the deadliest enemy. Artie tightened her grip on her sword, ready to swing for real, and right in front of Will, a tenebrae roared to life, a huge winged wolf with a third eye blazing in its face. He couldn't buy it. No way that thing was him. The beast was short, built all wrong in every way, and the resemblance had him whispering, "We might be related." I mean, the real Tenebris had a 9-foot head, a 6-foot tail, and 3-foot magnifiers. But Will still couldn't figure out why he wouldn't strike back, and maybe it was fear, because the beast god was in play, or maybe he just didn't want to get drawn into a fight with him. But Tenebris tore his gaze off Will and fixed it on Rosetta, who stared at the incomprehensible wolf like it had just crawled out of a nightmare, because the girl couldn't make sense of any of it, and all she could feel was shock or maybe straight up terror. Not long ago, this Tenebris was a monster, pure nightmare energy, so powerful no one could even match him. Then, out of nowhere, Rose got called out. Will was calling her then Tina because they were totally clueless about what just happened. The guy snapped that they had to rush back to the academy and get help while he tried to hold him back. Rosetta warned it was way too risky, but Will didn't flinch. He snapped back that it was them who were truly in danger and that he'd be fine. Tina tried to object, but the guy cut her off again, pressing them to run and grab help the second they could. Tina's mind snapped back to her friend's plea. She needed her help so badly, and right then, the girl's eyes brimmed with tears as dread swallowed her thoughts. She wouldn't make it. Rosetta shouted for everyone to listen to Will, and Tina spun around, rattled with fear, calling the girl's name. Already sprinting away from that guy, she begged, "Don't vanish." Will told her everything was fine and swore he'd come back alive, and the girls, fuming, bolted after him so they could help. He could use that ring to reach Zenobia, but he had no idea how long his strength would last before help arrived, because right in his hands, the ring flared, a spatial seal tore open, and suddenly he was talking to Zenobia. He swore it was Will, claimed a beast attacked them, and said they were battling it right now, but the voice blasting from the ring didn't buy a word. Will kept repeating that it felt like Tenebrae, like a monster of catastrophes, and that this might even be one of his kids. But from the ring, they told him, "We're coming right away. Stay put. Safety first." Artie swore she saw a ring and heard a voice she was sure belonged to the teachers. Then Will told her he'd spell everything out a bit later. Right now, they had to lock in on the enemy, and as soon as Artie agreed, she tore back into the fight. Will said he wouldn't let her face the fight alone, and then the guy reached for her broken sword, staring at it like it was begging him to decide. No matter what, that girl was powerless against the monster of disasters. An ordinary sword wouldn't stand a chance, so he had to find a way to power it up. When he started moving like that, the girl's cheeks flared with a deep blush, and pure embarrassment swallowed her whole. Right then, the girl blinked, and in her hand sat a brand new sword, replacing the broken one. She lit up with pure joy, and the guy rushed to explain he'd forged it in a panic. Sure, it wouldn't fail her. When the fighting started, Artie shot him an immediate grateful thank you. And then bam, a real Tenebris materialized right in front of them. They had to be sure the girl was fully ready, because they were going to take that thing down together. Behind them sat a slime and a goat, and Artie didn't hesitate. He agreed right away. Will steadied himself and snapped that this catastrophe monster won't slip away now. Then the guy hurled a Deathblade spell, and Tenebris transformed into a twisted evil creature he'd never been before. Then boom, two monsters of catastrophe came charging straight at them, their grins dripping with cruel mockery, and I'm like, this can't be real. But the guy tells her, just wait a bit. He slammed the seal straight into the ground, then he roared for the earth's hands, and right away, fists and palms erupted from the dirt, grabbing onto Tenebris's paws and clamping down hard. The guy blurted out that they finally had him then. Right on cue, heavenly arrows rained from the sky, streaking straight toward the disaster monsters. They'd already blurted it out, half in disbelief that they actually managed to pin him down. Then the zebra started howling, steam hissed from its nostrils, its growl turned savage, it roared even harder, and then a blinding light exploded out of it. The hands clawing up from the ground started forcing out the monster of catastrophes, an unstoppable nightmare, Will said, that could wipe out every last bit of magic with a single flap of its wings. Will refused to let him walk away with even a single scratch on his skin. Then the guy slammed the seal down, cutting off the monster of disasters, but he was barely holding on because the seal was already cracking and crumbling. He couldn't believe it. Right then, the monster started creeping in, and it snarled with horrifying sounds that were just like a goat bleeding. Turns out, the baby goat was the one that attacked Tina Brawl, and right after that, Will immediately praised him. He stared at the little goat from before, and suddenly it wasn't small anymore because a massive creature was staring right back. He shot out an angry remark right away, then pointed at the slime and snapped that it had ballooned so much like he'd already been thinking, and suddenly he understood this was a straight up competition. Will's animals instantly erupted into their own chaotic sounds, circling that disaster monster from multiple sides until it got overwhelmed and dropped. Then the guy just shrugged and said, with that kind of power, they might not even be needed here anymore. The monster's eyes bulged, then it lunged, spit slime, and flung the goat and the slime away like they were nothing. And turns out, the whole goat situation was a brutal clash between those two guys' animals. The monster glared with rage at the animals it had just knocked down, then snapped into protective mode, begging the disaster monster to back off. She warned that if it didn't, he'd lose his paws. He snarled, locked eyes on the girl, and sneered that she was pathetic then. Right on cue, glowing lights blasted toward her and she erupted into a scream. He immediately sprinted up to her, blurted out his name, and the girl quickly apologized. She said she hadn't seen them because she was sitting on the ground, propped up on her arm. He realized he'd accidentally bumped her while using a fog spell, and he panicked that their magic might be cursed, hoping she'd still be okay. Then he noticed he wasn't even dangerous, just insanely agile, and he knew he had to improvise fast or they'd both be in real trouble. Will spun a plan for a different kind of magic. Then the thought of his brothers hit him. He grinned and knew he had to go for it. Because when you mash together the magic of water, earth, and air, you land on the winning spell. He blasted this volley straight at the disaster monster, then the moment it struck him, he knew something was wrong, because the attack snapped into a water trap that flooded over his eyes and left him blind. He claimed he deliberately hurled the magic of earth and water at the monster's muzzle to blind and deafen it, then started jeering at the disaster beast because it couldn't hit him back anyway. He even warned him not to clean it up, because the mist magic won't save him. His power is just as strong as his own. Water magic shuts it down, and that's when the disaster monster's power finally breaks loose. Then the guy remembers battling with his brothers, and he knows he has no choice but to go all in. The disaster monster's mouth flared with a blinding glow, and the tiny Arel started to crumble and dissolve right in front of it. The moment had finally come so long awaited, so the monster's eyes bulged wide. Then it let out a bone-chilling howl, and foam blasted out of the tiny Arel's mouth. His grin turned even crueler than before. Then the poison sank into him, crawling through his body as the spell kept spreading, locking every inch of his carcass in place, while Will had no idea what it felt like to swallow his own power. Tenebris is going to flare with burning light again, and this time he'll lock in his defense, raising that sealed shield to fight back. He knew this wasn't going to hold. Some other power was calling the shots, crushing his defense. The seal was already splitting, and the guy could barely keep it together. He clenched his resolve and thought, One more push, then I'll reach the center. Then, right then, Tenebrelli's head was already under attack. Her blade driving straight through the heart of the disaster monster, Will yelled her name, and she snapped back without even looking, telling him she'd buy him the time to pull it off. Will's massive goat rammed its horns into the Tenebrelli's torso. Then the slime snapped onto the disaster monster's paw and instantly stained it black. Saddened, Will blurted that everyone had come to help him at last. Then the guy kept gripping that seal finger and finally admitted he'd managed to hold on for just a little more time. Then it hit him, he'd finally found what he'd been searching for. With the last shred of strength, he snarled to the disaster monster that he'd shatter its power, and at the same moment, that man grinned like he'd just spotted a way out. Tinebrold. Glowed blood erupted from his mouth in an extreme flood. He crumpled on the ground, furious heat burning in his chest as we stared him down, but he couldn't wrap his head around it. He'd pushed right to the center just to rip apart the force, never expecting it to unleash anything on the beast, especially since his hide was built like it could take a hit. After thinking it through, we told him this, that duel with those stupid brothers did nothing but sharpen him. Then those boys who'd been acting like something. They weren't flashed back in his mind again and again. Rage hit the guy the moment he realized RT had to be handled. Now she was bleeding bad. The girl snapped to the truth too. Realizing he'd cursed her, clutching her wound, she fought to keep her words straight. Will shot his hand toward Artie, and a blazing field snapped into place around her, sealing her wounds as she recovered fast so strong that the girl caught it instantly, and even Will's face twisted with confusion. Artie went on, saying that Beast was brutally strong and no weapon in the world could bring him down. Then it hit him, the little girl who told the master she failed, even though that demon didn't have arms or legs. Will smirked and told Zenobia she had a solid student, then ruffled Artie's head and waved it off like it was no big deal because the real win was that it was finally over. The girl awkwardly whipped her gaze back to the guy. Behind the boy, his past life loomed like a prophecy. She just had to get it, and the future would forge her into a ruthless warrior. Artie's cheeks went crimson, and she hurried to speak to the guy again. He froze in shock, because little Zenobia instantly slammed back into his memories. Then he panicked to change the subject, scrambling to find out where her sword was, but when the girl finally answered, she looked awkward as she admitted the blade was slightly damaged. But right then, she fully took control of him like it was effortless. The sword was light yet unbreakable. Its blade flashed with a gorgeous pattern, and it carried a powerful magic that practically hummed. Plus, its shape fit her grip so perfectly, she could hold it in her hands with total ease. Right then, Artie hesitated mid-sentence between the letters, like she was fighting to say something, then silence hit hard. Awkward as a wall, Will cut in at once, giving her the sword and laying down the rule he'd hand it to her as long as she didn't ask a single thing. He'll realize the goat and the slime finally settled into normal, regular shapes, and thank God they were all behind us. The guy crumpled onto the ground, fighting for breath, while she sat right beside him, exhausted to the bone, and said she was worn out too. The girl grabbed Will's hands and thanked him, because the sword that guy forged for her was whole again, and at last, the heroes could finally drop their guard and rest. Will and Artie shredded the disaster monster, and when it finally went down, they saw its body had crumbled to ashes, leaving only the core. They still couldn't believe they actually beat him just because his one weak spot was water magic. Will wrestled with the idea because when he fought on equal ground, he still held his own against every one of his techniques, and the terrifying truth was this. Will didn't even have a real weak spot, just some part of his body that finally buckled, giving them the opening to strike and land the fatal blow. Right out of the cracked core, a huge wing shot into view and snapped everyone's attention back. Then the egg burst open and multiple dragons spilled out. Will had no clue where those things even came from, and he just stood there, stunned, wondering what he was supposed to do next, right? As the master's disciples burst into view in the sky. At that moment, Rosetta and Tina pushed for help as fast as their legs could carry them. Rosso kept urging Tina on, but the girl snapped that she couldn't match her pace and demanded a breather. Then someone reminded them the monster was still closing in, and they had no choice but to sprint even farther to make it in time. If they don't move right now, everything will get wiped out. Tina's mind instantly spiraled, and she couldn't let that happen. Then, out of nowhere, an appeal for the girls came drifting in. The appeal got repeated, and Tina grabbed Rosetta's attention by saying she could hear them calling their names. Then, out of nowhere, voices boomed from somewhere above, and both girls snapped their heads toward the sound. Rosa shot up with rage while Tina fretted, but then the girls' faces flipped. Cheer took over in a heartbeat. Up in the treetops, above them all, 2 dragons hung in the sky, carrying Will, Artie, Zenobia, and Milt. And after everything that went down, they were already shoved into the director's office, and Milt insisted on a blow-by-blow retelling of what happened to them out in the woods. Suddenly, Zenobia whipped around to Rosetta and Tina and admitted she never even introduced them to the old man, that it was her own mistake, then urged them to get acquainted. because there was zero time to do it at the enlightenment ceremony, and that confession hit with a wave of guilty anger. The girl brought Milk to the other girls, and Milk immediately shot her a mental glare like, "Great, she's older than me." But she wouldn't let it slide, saying Milk was one of the directors and a ridiculously powerful magician. Rosetta and Tina were stunned by the news, and one of them blurted that meeting him was a huge honor, while Milk burst into laughter, insisting it didn't need all those fancy formalities. After all, he'd heard plenty about Tina, and if he wasn't mistaken, she and already were being hailed as Zenovia's best students. At the same time, Milt raved about the girls nonstop, and Tina's face burned with embarrassment at the director's support. Milt turned to Rosetta and said, "So you're the legendary hunter they keep talking about at our school? People like you are insanely prized." Rosetta's eyes went wide at the praise, and she protested, "No, I'm not that great." Zenobia demanded I tell her everything. Then she snapped her attention to Rosetta and Tina right as they blurted out, "There was a massive bear, only for someone else to cut in and scream. It was actually a wolf demon with terrifying huge wings." Tina and Rosetta spilled that the damage in Rosas' hometown hit the livestock hard and the demon's true story still hasn't been revealed. Then everything exploded into a fight with that demon, and Tenebris finally showed up. Rosetta couldn't believe what she heard when the name Tenebres hit her ears, and Tina swore she heard it too because Will himself had spoken it out loud the moment he saw that monster. We slipped away awkwardly, saying we just had to talk about it. Then Zenobia and Milt kept repeating the name Tenebris, because that monster was insanely powerful. After all, the Calamity Beast and Tenebris weren't some common monsters other magicians even talked about until now he and his disciples had already torn the Calamity Beast down, yet it still felt like certain people, especially the Seekers, knew exactly what it was. The Great Master and his disciples crushed a terrifying demon king who wanted to wipe out humanity, yet it felt like the Guardian army was quietly steering the truth, skillfully hiding the real story from everyone. Zenobia froze, unsure what to do next. Then Milk snapped back that she was the one giving orders here, and the man's fury burned hot. The girl mulled it over, then snapped, "We've got no choice. We're cutting it and labeling the trip under something else because every single one of us signed an oath of non-disclosure." Will realized way too late that he'd been signing papers just like these, but he couldn't even recall doing it, and sudden flashes of him stamping those forms stormed through his head. Zenobia said whatever they were talking about next would stay inside the office, and the second Will heard that, he immediately thought, once we find out what happened to us in that forest, that's all we'll need. He was convinced Tinny Brace and the Beast of Calamity were the Demon King's true titles, the one that the Great Master and his disciples once crushed, and that the bandits who struck them back then were nothing but the Demon King's loyal followers. A brand new rescue agency was built to tear this cult apart and crush it to the core, and not a single soul alive had any clue what secrets the Keepers were holding. Zenobia figured Tina's teacher had told her everything, and Will kept telling himself it was a good thing because he never brought up the Beast's resurrection or his own real identity. With a stone-cold serious look, Rosetta admitted she'd heard it too, and she swore the truth was something special. Zenobia then insisted they needed someone with her kind of power, so they came straight to her for help. The girl's cheeks flared red as she let out an awkward laugh, and Will suddenly clocked how painfully similar Rosetta and Tina were, but Rosetta just couldn't pin what set Artie and Will apart. Meanwhile, Zenobia sat there sipping from a mug, trying to juggle the explanation in a way that somehow never came out right. In the end, she admitted they found out about it ahead of time because they were students at their academy and heard they'd need help, so Will just chuckled awkwardly, but he was already sitting there, stunned and speechless. Tina finally understood why he was so battle-ready. Rosetta caught the moment too, because they already knew everything and didn't bother warning anyone, and Will just stared into what he'd say next, thinking about how he was a 200-year-old man and an apostle. Zenobia declared, "Now that we've got everything figured out, I need to hear from Will and Artie. No, I want a full detailed report from the exact place where that demon was wiped out." And the guys confirmed it. And right then, she started spilling the full report again and again. The directors leaned in, hanging on every word, because they'd tracked him before, yet nothing they'd ever seen matched this. Milt said there were times a person turned into a demon, but this was the first time he'd ever seen someone who'd already vanished come back as a demon, or even watched an old demon climb up to a higher rank, and he knew he had to stop and think it through. Zenobia thought it sounded ridiculous until she asked Tina to let her stay here for a while and keep her from going outside the building, and Tina agreed on the spot. You know, they were scared out of their minds and had no idea what to do next. Even though it was a high-ranked demon, only he and Artie knew what it really looked like, and the others were left scrambling, because he didn't buy that they'd actually killed the monster for good. Even if Tina somehow doesn't snatch the throne, the Empire will never let her slip away, as Crown Princess the Bear Demon is still standing, but Tenebris vanishes into the night. Meanwhile, Milk keeps trying to reach someone, but the phone just hisses back like it can't connect. And finally, he reached someone. Then that voice came through loud and clear. Milt spun to Will and Rosetta, because this was an emergency and he needed them right now. Will started piecing it together, trying to figure out what the heck just happened. He snapped back that enemies were closing in way tougher than Tinnitus Tina ever expected, and Tina demanded they uncover who they were, but Rosetta swore it was impossible, and Will couldn't wrap his head around why it was just him and Rosetta getting dragged into this assignment. Little girls' sobs rang out. Will and Rosetta's sisters sprinted straight at them, and the girls leapt into their arms. The teacher shot back an apology and admitted, "I can't keep holding you guys anymore. And honestly, they were so worried, they begged to see you as fast as possible. Then we apologized too, because we'd caused them way too much trouble." Saria couldn't stop panicking because her brother's safety was all she could think about. So when he finally checked in, he apologized for worrying her, said he was perfectly fine, and admitted the only damage was a little torn clothing. But to his little sister, that was still terrifying. The guy admitted he totally got carried away playing with a goat and a baby bear. Then the grower almost dropped her jaw the moment she heard that bear and goat story. She echoed his words, insisting he was just messing with them, and the guy apologized, then instantly grinned and said they had a new family member now. The girl scoffed, eyes wide with disbelief, and right then, the room filled with the unmistakable bleat of a goat, followed by Saria's thrilled shout. In Will's room, Saria teased the goat until it finally offered her a paw, and while she did, she named it Belyash. Then Belyash planted his paw on her head, and right away, blood started pouring. Will burst into laughter at the ridiculous picture, but the girl refused to quit. She demanded, "Do it again," then pointed at her hand and insisted, "Watch me and say it after me." Every one of their beasts carried divine power, and in his memories there was Rune Rune, who even planted a paw on Saria's head. Saria was absolutely obsessed with them. Like, she genuinely liked the kid, and remember this? Saria named her pet Whitey. And the goats finally calmed down too. Now it doesn't look like a threat at all, even if it still snaps and buds out on Will's leg when it gets worked up, but he can't figure out why the goat's doing it, because Will isn't its enemy. Still, for now, it's all good. Just as his thoughts started to spiral, boom, knock, knock on the door, a voice begged to be let in, and he opened up, but the second she stepped inside, the girl snapped, "Hurry!" The guy shot back, "I'm on my way," and right then she froze, completely dumbfounded. She definitely didn't expect the room to be packed with animals, and the moment she walked in, every single one of them burst into greeting sounds. Then Will forced an awkward smile and said, Saria thought they had too few animals. Artie told him, "Go on, take her to the nursery, I'll see you off." He got that it was probably Zenobia's call, but Artie insisted she shouldn't chase after him, she should just wait right here. And she refused, saying she wanted to go herself. Saria pushed to go with Will and the sister of Artie, then the girl flashed a smile at Will's sister and promised she'd tag along with them. The guy barked that they had to hurry right now. Then Milk turned to Will and realized the terrifying truth: he was trapped in a little boy's body, and his magic power was both weak and shaky as hell. Will was still baffled. He couldn't wrap his head around how they split the core in two, and he swore it was impossible, but with the guys backing him up and Artie pulling the demon's attention, he finally locked in, aimed his power, and drove it straight at the monster. Then he realized the water magic was backfiring on the demon, freezing its moves in place while the Beast of Calamity fought to siphon energy into it, trying to make something happen, and only after that did they finally learn the demon's weaknesses. We were finally supposed to figure it all out, but he didn't realize they couldn't just piece together what he was doing and even try to gauge what kind of power the disaster monster had. Still, thanks to them, we got the answer in the end, and Milt confirmed his suspicions. Andy leaned in and said he had one suggestion for them plus 3 requests. Will's eyes widened, but he stayed quiet and let Andy speak. He kicked things off by asking, "First things first, can you help me track down the disaster monster and its henchmen?" And Will didn't hesitate. He said he was totally fine cooperating. Milt told me Will could use his office anytime he wanted because all the needed papers were already locked in there and it would make the poet's work way easier. Then Milt said he'd fill them in later when the investigation kicks off. Will got it, thanked me, and we moved on. He also decided to jump straight into the request. He wanted Artie to be his teacher because he and she need nonstop practice, and when Artie hesitated, he shrugged like it was no big deal, saying bouncing around the school would feel way freer. Will said people might think he's sneaking training with Zenobia, the best student with the divine beasts, while Zenobia was actually busy feeding the animals, and Milk insisted they still needed the right educational guidelines just to confirm everything about the animals. They'll have to train harder to actually earn the skills they need, and tons of applicants are lining up to work with them, too. Will agreed. It made sense, but he worried that everyone would wrongly treat the measurement results as if they were proof of their true abilities. Milt said we could jump to the second request, then the question hit they wanted answers, and we were like, wait, what exactly is he trying to tell you? Milk grilled Rosetta about what her abilities were as a potential hunter, and he couldn't stop talking about how amazing it was because the way she found and tracked wild creature tracks was seriously top tier. Even though she's barely got any combat experience, she still rips with a bow, and on top of that, her personality is pure charm. She always carries real compassion for her sister and her friends, and Zenobia can't help but stare in awe at her. She swore they were a perfect four-person squad. Every one of them snapped into place, covering all the gaps and using their gifts to the fullest. Will was the magician. Already was the swordsman, Tina brought the healing, and Rosetta hunted from the shadows. Milk's words came out solid. He said he wants to team up with them too down the road, and Milk thanked him, grateful for it. Then the guy leaned in and asked what the third request was, because he figured that was the only thing the man wanted to talk about. But the man kept going, saying they wanted to talk more about Rosetta, about her future here, and Will had no clue what he meant. He pushed for Rosetta to become Regina's student because nobody could match Regina's weapon skills. She's a deadly archer and a master swordsman, he said. Will master everything, but he still couldn't figure out what exactly was wrong with that. Milt snapped that it was a disaster, Regina wasn't taking students, and Will flushed as the truth hit him. This was all about the girl. The man nodded, warning it would take ages to spell out why, and Will stood there waiting for the explanation. The man swore the tale happened 90 years back and that she only had one student while Regina fell hard for him, loving and respecting him so much that she poured every spare second into his life. One day, her hometown and their whole country got slammed by demons. While Regina fought to protect everyone back home, he stood guard across the nation, acting as a human shield and holding the line so the demons couldn't breach the building's gates. After a while, they finally surged back and crushed the demon, but it was already too late. The student had taken a fatal hit. Then, when Regina proved she could take the demon down, he vanished with a grin, like his job was done. She raised a kid with crazy talent, and on the day of the battle, he stood right beside him, seeing every single moment with his own eyes. But the demons are so ruthless that she can't take them on by herself because the enemy set everything up to keep Regina away while they move in and deal with her precious student. After that, all she could say was, "I'll never take students again." Will pressed for answers. Was Rosetta truly trustworthy, or what exactly was he demanding? Milk nodded that it was all clear Rosetta was understandable, but he'd already watched his best student vanish, and he wanted Will to remember what it felt like to lose a friend he'd battled beside. Zenobia told them they had to pull some strings to get her back, and yeah, it's been ages since that day. Now the request was simple: talk to her and beg her to take Rosetta on as a student. Because once we hear the full story, they told him, we'll finally understand why they were so desperate. So he could help drag Regina back from the darkness, because the pain of losing a student had once ripped through him too. Back when he was still a master, and that's why he understood exactly what she was feeling. And that's why we're going to agree, show up, and talk to her. Milk practically shined when her master answered. Still, he warned them not to expect miracles from that conversation, but deep down, the man was sure his words would somehow land in Regina's heart. They just wanted to be sure that was everything they needed to say to him. Milt nodded, confirmed it, and thanked him for listening. Then that guy stepped in to hit them with a reminder of what they talked about earlier. Out of nowhere, Zenobia snapped that they had to start right away, and then asked Milt if she could borrow his room to investigate. The poor guy was completely thrown, not even sure what to say back. In the end, she told him to clean out his office first. He had so much junk piled up that even the master couldn't find the papers he needed, and it made Milt's rage boil over. He swung around to the girl and told her his office was packed with crucial stuff that could never be tossed out. So Zenobia snapped back, asking what on earth those necessary things even were. Then everything went dead silent, and that awkward pause slammed right into the room. He'll break the news to the guys that he'll reach out a bit later, because even after all this time, he still insists everything should be perfectly organized, like he learned it in his last life. With a flash of anger, he snapped that next time he visited this office, the investigation room better be spotless and every essential thing should be tucked away where it belongs. Milk went beet red, muttered that he understood, and rushed out an apology. Will pushed through the door and found a girl waiting for him, and when her look hit him, it stunned him for real, but she didn't even blink, totally calm. The guy finally caught on. She'd been waiting here for him the whole time. She told him not to sweat it, like it was just part of his assignment. He let out a helpless breath, stuck with nothing but frustration against her. We'll hunt down Artie and ask her if she has a minute, then we'll step into this dining room looking place where all the guys are already sitting, and the moment the conversation starts, they shrug and say, "Yeah, you heard him earlier, she doesn't have to trail after you." Artie thought it would grind his gears, but he cut that off and said it wasn't the point. Then she stared at him for ages with a deadly serious face, and it totally flustered him when he finally tried to speak up. It only made things worse and embarrassed her too, but now he had something real he wanted to ask her. Finally, he admitted he had no clue why she was so desperate to get close to him, and that only made him want to dig deeper and find out the truth. The girl started blurting apologies right away, insisting it wasn't anything like what he could have thought, while he stared, confused, saying he hadn't even considered that, and somehow the whole awkward moment still turned into something crazy interesting. Artie was freaking out about him. Like, there's no way these experiences happened by accident. She knows exactly who Tenebris is because Zenobia made sure she understood him. Then when he attacked, Zenobia was too caught up in the chaos to say a word, and Tenebris already knew everything about Will. in this monster, and the girl blurted it out, mortified. She thought she really needed to apologize for digging up the secret he'd been guarding all this time. Then she was hit with the twist. He told her not to apologize because everything was fine. We're heading back to Artie because there's one more secret she doesn't know about Will. His real name, not the one she's been calling him. Edelphus Worms, he said that was his name, even from a past life, and when Artie finally looked at Will again, it hit her, he wasn't just a master, he was the right one. Will thought she wouldn't buy it, until he reminded her other teachers could back him up because they'd all taught her before, but to his shock, she said she believed him. She looked like she'd just realized he was something different, a truly unusual guy. He couldn't believe she took his words that fast. She told him reincarnation was insanely rare in their time, yet it had happened, even been verified, and it was way rarer for someone to actually keep memories from a past life. An 8-year-old boy beating the strongest magicians and mowing down powerful demons that easily. No way everyone knew, only a true master could pull that off, and Will insisted it was all possible because of her help. She snapped back to another detail and decided to dig in, convinced that even animals were part of the definition. Then he nodded, confirming everything, and admitted he just wanted to talk about them. He tried to tell me a goddess did this to him, and Artie was convinced he must be one of the gods' favorites. Then he explained how he'd clawed his way out of death and into the present day. She had no clue what kind of divine guardians, beasts, and half-breeds these things even were. But the moment I saw it, it all clicked. Yeah, it was real. Every bit of it. And once we explained that normal animals can't possibly wield power like that, the whole truth becomes crystal clear. He told me that everything he just confessed was our secret now, and that nobody, not even Anobia or the other teachers, knew a thing he'd already told me not to worry, since she wouldn't spill it, but she didn't get why he'd chosen to say all that to her. He said it was because he trusted her the same way he trusted himself, and the girl couldn't wrap her head around that. Even as one of the rescuers, he'd watched her throw herself into danger for his sake. Anyone would do this, he insisted, if they were standing in your shoes. He swallowed his pride and went dead quiet, then snapped his head toward Artie, telling her he had one request, and the girl instantly leaned in, listening like it was life or death. Will wanted her to stand beside him and smash the monster of disaster, and he needed a real hero, someone decent at his side, fighting evil like they did 100 years ago. She thought it through because she'd be standing right beside the master and finally knowing everything about his past, not just rumors, so she took a quick breath and said, she was honored beyond words to join him in this battle, and that she'd give everything she had to make sure he wasn't disappointed. Will thanked Artie and practically begged her to keep treating him like Will never liked some master, and Artie just smiled. Whatever you say, Will. While I couldn't help but hope those two would click and work like a dream. He wanted to ask her what she thought about working out today. She'd already nodded and promised she'd show him a couple of fresh tricks, but just when things were about to start, a voice from outside the door demanded Will right away, because they had to tell him something. Tina and Rosetta stormed around, pissed about something, until they realized he wanted them to join him, and when they finally looked, there were already 4 cups of tea waiting on the table. Will bragged that their training was rock solid, and yeah, he'd seen it before. During the entrance exams and even in the forest when they rescued him, the girls trained every single day. But none of them understood why he suddenly pushed for them to team up. Tina wasn't exactly a fighter, so she already felt useless, but Rosa wasn't in top shape either. And during their last mission, they had to sprint for help and still couldn't save them. He figured they'd buy into his plan in no time, so he pulled them close and demanded they hear him out because he was itching to make something happen. To stand side by side with them so someday they can crush the monster of disaster and the other demons they'll have to train without stopping, sharpening their skills and magic every single day. Turns out, he wanted to round them all up and crush the monster of disaster, so they nodded with serious faces, making sure everyone understood it the right way. Even if they can't meet up on the train, schoolwork will still hammer them with knowledge and sharpen their tactics. Tina's a DEON student too, so she's in great hands, but yeah, he still looked a little lost. It's not that he doesn't trust them. Tina and Rosetta are academy students, and they've got zero ties to the Salvation Army yet. Tina's a princess, and Rosetta has a sister. And if disasters strike during the fight with the beast, something bad will happen to them. Will's thoughts get yanked away when Tina suddenly looks confused, and blurts that she's not strong enough to fight. She'd get spooked, bolt into the bushes, and freeze. The moment battle started totally helpless, and the girl admitted she couldn't forgive herself for it. This time, she decided to face her fears head on, then step in and help fight that monster, proving to herself she was strong enough to stand up for her friends and shield them from the monster of disaster. Rosetta felt the same pulse as Tina, so she nodded along to every word because she was determined to help Will and stand shoulder to shoulder with him in the fight against the demon. Because if they march into their lands, innocent people will pay the price, and if they so much as touch her sister, she'll blame herself forever and never forgive a single day. So she decided she had to get stronger so she could protect Rose and Will too. Because they're friends, and that meant they were in it together, the guy just stared, totally amazed at how fired up they all were. He apologized for piling pressure on them with his requests, then lit up when he realized they chose to help him and stand by him. Even though he already knew what they'd say, he still couldn't resist asking again because he needed to be sure they'd team up with him to take on the disaster beast. And the girls lit up, telling him they were friends and of course they'd help. Will said they could kick off training right now, and the girls jumped on it instantly because when he heard them, it yanked him straight back to the days when his own students stood beside him as kids. And he realized just how lucky he was. First, the girls had to take Will down with nothing but raw hand-to-hand combat, no shortcuts, no weapons, and Will just egged them on while he waited for them to strike, because the girls were already pumped and ready to go. Regina snapped that her work was done for the day, then turned to leave because she wasn't just heading back, she was going to teach a lesson to the boy who dared to show up acting like a master. At that exact moment in the training hall, the target got nailed with a clean shot. Rosetta fired it over her shoulder, and right behind her, Will was losing his mind, cheering, "You're doing great." He never expected it. Now, she'd have to burn through all that magic power just to land the hit. Rosetta awkwardly thanked him, and the training techniques he'd learned in those sessions suddenly proved their worth in a dozen different ways. Just a week ago, he kicked off the exact same training sessions after spending his whole childhood training every single day at Worms Manor, the place he was born. Normally, once that magic inside your body keeps flowing, you move without it. The power just gets wasted. So the circulation doesn't just run anymore, it adapts, cranks up the speed, and your control sharpens at the same time. Behind Will and Rosetta, punches flew, then Tina blasted in with fireballs, landing every single hit with all her charges, praying Will noticed, and when the guy said he did, Tina pulled off the coolest one like it was nothing. The gays charged for the last girl, only to end up with Artie, who was sprinting like crazy and yanking out her sword. She nailed every target in their own spot. And when the girl finally exhaled, her smile spread wide because that's exactly what he wanted from Artie lethal, top-tier swordsmanship. At first, every move felt awkward and clunky, but once magic power kicked in, everything snapped into place like it finally had a rhythm again. Artie even laughed and said she was in perfect shape today. Rosetta beamed with that "we're unstoppable" feeling, then Will told her to stop stressing because she was already making progress on her own. The signs are clear. These two people have the upper hand because they're disciples of the great sages, so everything's fine now. And she finally doesn't have to worry, but the girl is stunned because she never expected someone to say something like that to her. Will told Tina straight up that her magic control wasn't improving at all. She could sling fireballs, sure, but her aim was a mess, and Tina realized way too late that while everyone else got praised, her powers weren't. Tina snapped to it. Will had been flashing magic power in that fight, and the guy rushed in to confirm it on the spot. Then Will turned back to Artie, who fired off another question about close combat, and the guy backed her up without hesitation. He said he'd already mastered magic power, but if she kept training, she'd use it just as skillfully by driving it into her own body stronger than ever, and the girl got it fully, ready to do anything it takes. Then he decided to press her for the truth. How did she like her brand new sword? She didn't even hesitate, saying the weight and length fit her perfectly, like it was made for her, and when she swung it, that blade felt magnificent, so natural, it might as well have been part of her own body. When he crushed the Makuma, the demon bear, his sword suddenly felt weightless and effortless, but since he forged it in a rush, every swing chipped away at its durability. You can bet she'll feel proud because this blade was basically an improvisation, one wild idea brought to life, and if she's going to carry it, she'd better lock in on every tiny detail. He forged it with real care, picking the materials just right so it could take on every fight. He'd already figured out his style, but she wasn't asking about that. She wanted the real question answered. Where in the world did he get materials for this sword? The smart young guy teamed up with the swordmaster with insane energy, and their blade skills lined up with the legendary sword. Then it got weird. The show's control was Zenobia, the production was Delphace, and the whole thing was backed by Milk Resources. Will swore he'd never come close to anything like that, and the girl looked genuinely sorry, thanking him for putting up with her for such a short time. The guy then froze, stunned that she even knew the sword's name. He mulled it over, and of course, just like a proper swordmaster in his role, he stocked up with weapons too. Before he could even swing Artie's sword, he knew he had to master the basics first. And in those early days, he drilled his magic power until it was second nature. Will couldn't stop imagining how he'd take Rosetta's offer and turn it into the best day ever. But if the wizards outshined the master blacksmiths in this whole situation, he'd already scoped out the blacksmith's house, built by a man who'd learned everything from books. Will couldn't wrap his head around why this sword's name was Terracing then. Just like he expected, the blade lived up to it. Rosetta stared at Artie, stunned by how effortlessly she moved, and you could see it in her face. She wasn't sure she could pull off the same kind of success. Next day, Tina sprinted up to Will and greeted him with fire in her voice. "Today's got interesting lessons coming. And I'm pumped. Rosetta jumped in, smiling hard, and said they were about to have a great time. Tina's mission was clear climb to number 1 in the medicine classes, and Rosetta even offered to tag along. Then it all blew up again when, by some insane miracle, they picked the exact same electives. Tina grilled Will, asking if he'd gotten his assignments, but the poor guy didn't know what to say. I mean, I'll only have to do something for the exam at the end of the semester, he muttered, and that answer stunned the girls. Tina snapped, furious that they weren't going to do assignments together anymore, and Rosetta was clearly just biding her time. Then the guy's stomach dropped and guilt crashed in. Rosetta and Artie couldn't be more different, so the seller figured she might be shopping for a new sword, and Artie, of course, expected this from Will. The academy's lessons were suddenly the top priority. Will had already carved through that beast like it was nothing, so why did it feel like he might never use that power again? And honestly, Rosetta wasn't convinced she could pull off the same kind of victory. Meanwhile, in the director's office, the guy snapped, "Will Worms is here," and told him to come in, like this meeting was totally casual, not a big deal. Slime and that goat bolted straight for the door. The guy lunged to stop them. Then something snapped his attention. Someone else was sprawled on the couch. Then they called Will Worms. The guy confirmed it was him, said it had been forever since they'd last seen each other, and pointed out Regina as if she were the mystery in the room. The girl slammed her palm on the table and snapped, "Back off, I'm talking to him." We cracked up and told her she was shallow to the bone, then her face went white. She snapped at him to shut up and shouted that he was a brute, but he kept talking until he said her name, and that's when she got silenced. Dion was the one who told Will that, in his new life, he'd interrogated Milton and Zenobia about all kinds of stories down to every detail. Will told Dion, "Yeah, it's been 100 years. And he made sure Dion got the point because back then, he himself was towering at about 2 meters tall. Dion burst into laughter and said that if things were truly like that 100 years ago, then yeah, everything's changed since Will Grind nodded and agreed, saying it was the truth, because after a whole century of shifts, he was still genuinely blown away. Regina snapped at Diane to stay back from him, then shot into the air, grabbed the guy by his collar, and warned him that he could trick Zenobia and Milt, but he'd never pull that stunt on her. Magical Beast started roaring, and Zenobia just stood there, heart heavy, while the Master and Regina bickered. The guy spun around and told Fury and Beliash, "Everything's fine." Then he added, "She's my friend, not your enemy." The girl figured he'd keep pretending to be their master until he cut her off and declared, "I'm the real deal." Then she demanded proof, and he said he'd be more than happy to show it. He realized Regina had to remember the promise she made to him as a kid. Then the girl froze, startled by what he was saying. A memory of that promise snapped through her mind. She'd vowed she'd grow strong, no excuses, and she meant it. Will even said he'd been given his word to take good care of her guns. Regina was seething with fury, but she couldn't even wrap her head around it since he was only 5 back then. Still, curiosity got the better of her, so she slipped into his lab, spotted the stuffed marine animals, and panic hit so hard that tears burst out of her. Will, the girl, called him a master and told him she'd sworn he'd keep it secret. Then the guy smirked and said that proved nothing, and he even decided to bring up the sword to Zenobia again, even though she'd already begged him to stay silent. Zenobia had zero clue what was happening, but Regina erupted in joyful screams, then burst into tears and clung to the master by the neck while he tried to get her to calm down. Zenobia spun towards his master, still stuck on what Regina had done to her sword, while the girl blurted to Will that she'd missed him like crazy. Dion shot his hand out and said he was just as relieved to see this meeting happen and that he was okay. Will lit up with pure happiness too. But right then, he snapped around to face Dion and blurted out another old tale because he had to make him believe, and once he started talking, Dion didn't even hesitate. He already knew, from the very beginning, that this was their master. When they finally caught up, everyone just stood there, ready to hear Will spill what happened to him during those 100 years, and one guy was sure she'd already gotten the tale from Zenobia. But she kept quiet, trusting they'd want the truth straight from him. Regina demanded to know how he crushed Tenebris, and I was desperate to hear the full story because that guy couldn't get a single word out while her arms were locked so tight around him. The girl snatched his hand and yanked him onto the sofa, demanding he tell her everything, then blew his mind because he never expected her to be this hooked on the story. Will couldn't figure out what Regina was up to. She flashed that blissful smile, got as close as she could to the master's aura and wrapped him in a hug, but Will couldn't shake the feeling there was more going on. The girl shrugged, saying he'd be grown up in no time anyway, so she insisted on cuddling their master while he was still small, and Will just stood there, baffled, telling her to do whatever she wanted. After Will's reincarnation, everything that followed was pure chaos, so when Regina heard it, her rage flared because they'd bullied the master, and she swore she'd wipe out the worm's entire family. Will told her, "Don't stress about me if you don't go hurting anyone, you can just leave me out of it." The girl let out a sad sigh and nodded along. Diane leaned in and told Regina that anyone with power has to be held back, and even knowing how dangerous it was, Diane still pulled everyone together. Every one of Will's students showed up as kids, and yeah, he even raised Dion from an egg plus. Since Dion was his first student and the eldest of the bunch, Will always made sure they stayed together. Regina figured she'd dragged Dion through way too much trouble, then he shot back right away, swearing it wasn't true because he was only trying his best. Will marched up to Dion, told him he was doing great, and it totally threw the first student off like, wait, why would he say that? It was clear Dion had been putting in serious work while Will was gone, and then they thanked him too. Dowell and let a tear slid down his cheek, and he blurted out an apology, insisting his tears only meant he was overwhelmed. Will snapped at him to drop it. Then Belyach lunged in, licking those salty cheeks clean as the tears kept tasting the air. Will threw out a quick apology, admitting he was still just a kid. Dion lit up and told him it was totally okay. Belyach was sweet after all, but that didn't mean he could sit on Dion's head, and Dion insisted everything was fine anyway. Milt decided to drop the topic and jump straight into what happens next because he couldn't stop thinking about how his get-together with Tina and the girls actually went. He shot back that everything was fine and that training had already begun, then swore he'd wipe out the beast of calamity for good. Milty leaned in, curious about whether his real identity could finally be exposed, and he only admitted he told Artie the truth. The guy felt like Tina still wasn't ready compared to Artie, and honestly, it didn't look like they were caught unprepared in that moment. It's just that the girls were playing a whole other game, while Artie had already slipped into the rescue squad, and if they ever found out, he'd be forced to leave, so Dion thanked me for getting it. Will wants to pull Regina aside right now, because among the students, the Master's Ward has a hunter named Rosetta. Regina shoots back that she's already heard that name, and I'm like, yeah, she must have really proven herself during the demon hunt. He decided to pitch it to her, letting him take Rosetta to his students, and she sighed that he'd started the same conversation again, snapping that she wasn't cut out for teaching and that Milty fit the job way better. Milk City was already stamped as the master's teacher, at least on paper, while Zenobia handled Artie and Dion covered Tina, so now she was the only one left who hadn't taken a disciple. Even if Milt's just a pretend master, taking Rosetta on as his second student still slams him with a whole new weight, and you'll see just how sharp she really is. For the last 100 years, that's exactly the kind of atmosphere the Council of Sages has been meeting in, and as their teacher, he couldn't help but smile, watching it all unfold. Deanna nodded along with Regina, no hesitation at all. Then Milch burst out, yelling Deanna's name, but he also insisted that she should take on a student. Regina snapped, furious that he'd said it. And Will suddenly wondered if this argument had been going around again and again. Regina spiraled over what she'd been doing wrong, who she should even take as a student, and she desperately wanted to know what the master really thought about it all. She never saw herself as someone who could train a student, but the master treated it like no big deal at all. The girl tried to tell Wilden, "I'm still weak," but he refused to believe it since he'd already pegged her as super strong. Then Dion shot back, "If you're not ready, then we're even less so." Regina couldn't stop worrying. What if she stuck her neck out again and got her student in trouble? Will promised that if it ever happened, they'd pull out every stop to stop it before it could spiral. She regretted that she couldn't change anything back then, and Will wondered if that guilt kept clawing at her every single day, so now he believes it's time for her to pour that soul into a new student. Regina didn't know if she could do it. Fear kept whispering that she wasn't ready yet. Then Will flashed a smile and swore she could do anything, and he meant it, because he'd raised her himself and asked her to trust him. Regina said it meant what she just claimed, and the guy, happy as anything, blurts out her name right on the spot. Then it's finally time for her to step up and take on an apprentice. Everyone erupted, shouting her name, and it instantly threw her into an embarrassing spotlight until she finally steps up and makes her call after she meets Rosetta face to face and finds out exactly what she's made of. Will swore he'd bring her straight home right now, only she was still stuck in class. Regina said she had to get ready too, so she figured tomorrow was the smart move. Milk stared like, "Wait, I'm supposed to prepare?" Regina strode down the hallway with Rosetta on her mind, already buzzing at the thought of finally meeting her because class was over and Tina was sprinting after the hunter, shouting her name, desperate to confirm she was done with lessons so she could practice. Rosetta told Tina she had to handle some business today, then apologized for missing practice, and Tina just smiled back, and both of them waved goodbye, happy as can be. Rosetta figured if she pushed herself harder, maybe she could keep from weighing everyone down. Four guys stood outside the director's office, and Rosetta's nerves were shredding her. Right before they met the director, Artie told her she'd get used to it one day. But Will snapped at Whitey because the moment he stopped staying home, his behavior went straight off the rails. Artie stood before the door and blurted that Madam Director herself had invited them, then rushed out an apology for the wait and waved them into her office right as the doorbell rang and the door swung open. Zenobia sat at her desk and breathed out, saying it felt good that they'd finally made it here. Then her smile hit the room as she turned to the group. Even Rosetta blinked, stunned that Zenobia was happy to see all of them. yes, including her. Zenobia then spun towards someone and said she could step out now. A chilling, booming laugh echoed through the room, leaving all the girls completely stunned, and someone blurted that they'd come to smash the disaster monster. Then Hinoshiko stepped in, thanking them for the plan, and yeah, she's the one with the seat on the Council of Sages. Regina Idaru's hero, Gracia, was here, and the girl came dressed in armor, gripping an axe tight as Tina and Rosetta started trembling from pure fear. She was ready to grab a higher rank because she didn't want to stop crushing anything, and she demanded to know if Hyoshiko had any real future plans. Tina curtsied, said she was thrilled to meet you, introduced herself, and followed every etiquette rule to the letter because that's exactly what an emperor's daughter would do. Regina's eyes narrowed so hard, the look still showed through her mask. She told her that Tina was Dion's student and that she'd give it everything she had, then stood there waiting for instructions only for Tina to just smile, thank her, and leave her hanging. The girl in the armor froze when she saw Rosetta standing right in front of her, heart pounding with fear and excitement at once. Still, she managed to blurt out, "I'm so glad to meet you." The armored knight's glowing eyes locked on, and the girl flinched harder than before, so we stepped between Rosetta and Regina to shut down their flare-ups. Will was laughing inside his own head because he knew Regina was laughing too. Hermes had that voice changer trick, and they both couldn't help finding it hilarious. Later, the guy shot Artie a look. Her face stayed ice straight since only one of them could afford to be careless. Her eyes locked on the distance like she was trying not to get caught, and he could feel it. She wanted to rip into him, but she was forcing herself to hold back. Regina snapped that her behavior was rude, then suddenly switched gears. She insisted Sophia had actually recommended Rosetta be made her student. The girl was trembling, completely stunned by what she'd just heard. Of course, Rosetta felt honored, but the moment the knight praised her for teaching that gifted girl, Rosetta shot up her hands and shouted, "No!" because his words clearly didn't match what she believed. That knight caught her staring through those tiny slits in her eyes, and Rosetta's stomach dropped because it hit her like a punch. Regina was wrong, and someone like her could never become a student under a teacher like that. And the knight itself looked just as confused. She didn't turn her student into a weapon. Then the robot suddenly spoke in this calm, joking voice, acting like it didn't look half as bad as the teachers kept warning them about, and now she couldn't figure out why she'd refused. And finally, it hit her. She understood why the student had totally crushed his fighting spirit. Regina told me to slow down and think it through. Then Rosetta faced the knight, and the voices surged right after her. Tina clocked two strangers in the room, and Zenobia practically lit up, stunned but pleased by Rosetta's grit, while the whole office went silent when the director dropped those shocking words. Zenobia whipped his head toward Will and blurted out what he'd promised tea and sweets. And then, boom, Bellyash and the truck rolled in too. The animals immediately welcomed the director, and suddenly, cups of tea filled the table. Rosetta couldn't figure out why the director picked her, so did she plan to crush the monster of catastrophes? But when she answered, she sounded just as lost. She didn't get it at all, because one person was getting stronger and another just wasn't. She kept thinking she was useless. Everyone else's power kept climbing while hers just stayed stuck, and that crushed her. Then Zenobia's grinned and told her, "All right then, sounds like Regina's student has the best of everything." Rosetta said the hero's disciple could carry two warring deities inside them. Zenobia snapped back that her power wasn't just a blessing from above. And then right when the fight hit its peak, we'd flee the battlefield with one of the demon families. Rosetta confirmed it all. But she had one secret, and she never told me a word about it because they already had her trembling, all set to be a witness. Rosetta busted her way into being a top-notch student, and everyone could see it. Her real strength and talent hit different for each person. Will's animals crowded around Zenobia's feet, chirping cutely, and Regina stayed on standby, just waiting for the perfect moment to claim Rosetta as her student. But the director promised she'd get the full details soon, and honestly, even if she's got no real talent, she still absolutely outdid herself on the test. Will, meanwhile, kept thinking Rosetta had slipped up and made mistakes again and again during the prep. And the director even said she can swear it. There's not a single flaw in her and that she shouldn't rush. She needs to stop and think first, then commit to her choice. Rosetta beamed and agreed right away. Belyashik suddenly bolted, reached the director's mistress's suites, and the goat got labeled a greedy little brat then. After that chat, two tiny girls fell asleep in Will's room while the guys kept talking. Tina grinned and said it'd be awesome if she became a student, agreed. Instantly, and then we caught Rosetta's downcast face and had to wonder what had her so worried. She couldn't stop replaying those beautiful words like, if Will's talent has a whole level, then grinding harder won't magically fix it, and honestly, she had no clue how to do it better here. So Will urged her to go talk to the students. Rosetta remembered Tina once swore she'd never become an apprentice, and right now, guilt was gnawing at Rosetta in the exact same way. Zenobia snapped that they were even a little early, and if they wanted to meet Dion's student, they'd better sprint out for a jog right now. Yet, the truth was, Dion was already inside the organization, gearing up for a training session. Rosetta couldn't figure out what Artie was doing here. She was so locked in her own thoughts that she barely registered anything, and honestly, it felt pretty damn weird. At first, her dad was being watched over by her teacher, but when she was 3, he vanished without a trace. Then at 5, that same teacher stepped in and basically became her new parent, and Rosetta nearly lost her mind when Artie dropped that bomb. She said that ever since then, she's been grinding hard with swords first because she already loved the sword training, and then she started learning under Zenobia back in the day. To get a divine sword, you had to pay an enormous price. Will swore that if they took down the monster ravaging everything around them, and even the religious crew, while they had no weak points to exploit, he'd still beat them, and with Rosetta by his side, they'd survive the dangerous monster together. He flat out confirmed it. Yeah, we're doing it. Rosetta's heart sank, but she still nodded. Then he snapped, "We're coming back today." And that news hit Rosetta even harder than before. Rosetta asked, voice heavy, if she was being helpful, then we'd tell her she was wrong, because that plan never mentioned anything about being useful. Will said the students who came in were already turning back, so he figured she should have asked him first because she and Tina aren't ready to take on enemies like that yet. Not the truly dangerous kind. Rosetta clocked what Will said about opponents so brutal they'd break you, and in that moment, she realized the sick truth: every enemy out there was stronger than her and stronger than Tina too. She remembered the devil and Tenebrine, and the moment she admitted death wasn't scary, she was lying through her teeth. Fear wasn't just lurking, it was a test for both of them. While they trained, Rosetta kept measuring herself against everyone else, and bit by bit, her confidence vanished. The girl broke down in tears, knowing she couldn't save their hopes. Tina quickly patted her on the shoulder, trying to calm her down. Rosetta blurted out non-stop apologies, and Will just couldn't wrap his head around how crushed Rosetta was. And honestly, kindness can wreck people's lives. Suddenly, they're forced to climb impossible mountains, and nobody realizes it until it hits. He tried everything to get Rosetta to finally listen. He told her the one thing that mattered most: never lose hope, and that hit her like a truck. The shock flipped a switch in her, and she immediately started snapping at Will, no longer wanting to talk to him at all. So he figured it was better to just keep speaking. Everyone thought she had real talent, but it was like her true power hadn't even cracked the surface yet. Rosetta was terrified of messing up, and when the moment finally hits and she has to face monsters, he'll step in and tell her what to do. Even though she's only just kicking off her journey, she's still tough as nails, so he turned back to Rosetta and told her she could become an amazing student herself. If Zenobia senses his students aren't all carrying the same strength, then they'll be forced to haul the exact same weight somehow. Rosetta just couldn't wrap her head around how it even happened. The headmistress pushed Regina to take the test, and she fought tooth and nail to finish, yet she still crushed it with a brilliant score right up until she hit just one tiny mistake out of 10,000. If she pulls it off, then Regina's hunger to get even stronger won't stop, so Rosetta just needs to trust herself, because the girl's ears twitched right away. She said, dead sure, that she'd passed the test Regina took, and the guys lit up, promising they'd help her all the way. She just grinned back at them, warm and grateful. Tina said it's way more fun with company, and Rosetta tried to cut her off until Will jumped in, saying then she could handle it herself. Artie nodded right along. At last, the knight stood before her, ready to test whether she was truly prepared, and Rosetta didn't hesitate. She declared she was ready, then demanded to take the exam. That knight's calm looked like a warning she was fully ready, and behind her back, Will just grinned, like, she definitely didn't prep for you guys. Regina, masked and turning toward Will, figured his condition wouldn't let him handle it. So in her head, Will snapped back that she should have just waited a little longer. Artie leaned over to Zenobia and promised she'd make sure there was always tea in her cup today. Zenobia thanked her. Right then, the Madam Director was already sitting at the table, and Artie prayed she wouldn't catch how Regina was acting. That night, he figured he was scared, but he shot back that the real childish thing happened once. When Regina even interrupted Zenobia's blade and then promised she'd spell out the test's essence, explaining it only that one time. Just like she said before, this mission is supposed to be easy: reach the dungeon's deepest core and prove every skill you've got, but then it hits her, she's going alone. And when I finally clocked the real problem, I understand it. The scout's job is to protect Pat, so I decide to go solo too. The second her teacher gives the green light, she bolts straight for the dungeon. Once she's inside, she'll immediately size up what to do next, even though she's never gone this deep before, and the whole thing is going to force her to make it work. Lessons were already underway, so she figured she'd rest tomorrow morning, while Will snapped that she needed to hurry to the dungeon. Then a guy told her to do something, and Regina just stood there, waiting for him to spell out what he meant. He blurted that he wanted custody of his little sister until the exam ended, and the girl shot back that they still had time. Then Zenobia sprang up, snapping that the kids had been stuck at home way too long, and insisted they go visit before they leave. Now that they finally had a moment, they dashed off to get ready, and Tina had to go with them too. Soria clocked that her brother was swamped today, and she knew he'd confirm it himself. He swore that next time he'd be back in just 2 days. Rosetta rushed to apologize to Rosa. The little girls shot each other quick looks, then waved everything off. No problem, and acted like it was a whole big deal. Will told her she was already thinking like a grown-up, and she insisted everything was okay while Will and Soria quietly believed their brother would be fine too. The look on his face said it all. He was stunned by their trust. So, yeah, when it came down to it, Soria had no choice. She had to look after Rose. Ren also wants to stay with Will, and Will agreed on the spot. Then the teacher bragged that the dog is a hit with kids and helps them tons, and Will praised the dog right away. Soria could tell the teacher's mood had lifted, but she had no idea why then. After a quick chat, they shared a goodbye and parted ways. Rosetta told me to stay put and wait for Will because someone was here. Then Zenobia stared at the girl, paused for a beat, and said that since she'd arrived, they'd already prepared something, and Rosetta's face instantly tightened with worry. On the table, a bunch of mystery objects sat there, and Rosetta had no idea what any of them did. Zenobia swore they'd be the key to exploring the dungeon, but getting to the right place was going to take forever. No shops meant no easy grabbing. She had to pick only what she truly needed. And Tina with Rosetta had to choose every last item with razor-sharp caution. Tina snapped that she was finished with the selection, and Rosetta told me to hold on for a second, while Zenobia reassured the girl there was still time. She was stuck between grabbing magic torches or taking the spare bow and arrow, so she made me wait again, only this time, we were already creeping up on the dungeon, surrounded by different dragons. Some random guy slid up to Zenobia and promised, "We'll help anytime." Zenobia shot back, "You're already right at my fingertips." Will just stood there, stunned by how gorgeous the building was. And yeah, there are couples ready to pair up, Tina with Rosetta and Artie with Will. The guy stared at the oncoming dragon and, in one wild move, begged to ride it so it let him, and the thing will thank him later. He'd already swung onto its back and was reaching out to Artie, but Artie snapped that it looked ugly. The girl slid in behind Will, wrapped her arms around him, and a bright blush of pure embarrassment instantly sparked across her face. He already had something on his mind, but the second she asked him to drop it, he did then. Growing up, Mrs. Director used to write her name on a horse, and Will couldn't help it. He burst into laughter because he'd instantly pictured the whole thing. Suddenly, a brutal gust slammed into the girl's face. Hang on. It felt like the wind was screaming as she fought to stay steady while up in the sky, two massive dragons flapped off into the distance.